The wind's picking up something fierce out here tonight, folks. I can hear it whistling through the pine trees surrounding our little station, rattling the windows like restless spirits trying to get in. Perfect weather for the stories we're about to share. You're listening to UNMR, Nocturnal Mysteries Radio, and I'm your host, Edward Cronkite, broadcasting live from our transmitter station deep in the Blackwood Forest. It's just past 11 on this October evening, and my coffee's grown cold while sorting through the mountain of letters, emails, and voice messages you've sent in response to last week's call. I asked for stories from those who work in the places where knowledge sleeps, our libraries, archives, and repositories of human memory. The response has been overwhelming. Tonight, we're diving into something special. Tales from the keepers of knowledge. Those brave souls who tend to our books and manuscripts long after the rest of us have gone home. Because let me tell you something. When the fluorescent lights dim and the last patron shuffles out, these repositories of human knowledge take on a life of their own. Our first story tonight comes from Grace. She sent me a handwritten letter. And yes, people still do that. Postmarked from Chicago, Illinois. Her handwriting is precise, methodical, the kind you'd expect from someone who's spent years cataloging rare volumes. But there's a tremor in some of the later lines, a slight shake that speaks to something that shook her to her core. Grace works at the Newberry Library, one of Chicago's most prestigious research institutions. For those unfamiliar, the Newberry isn't your typical public library. It's a fortress of rare books and manuscripts, a place where scholars come to commune with documents that have survived centuries. Grace has been there for 7 years, working her way up from part-time shelver to full-time rare books librarian. She loves her job, she says, or rather, she did. Let me read you what Grace shared. Dear Mr. Cronkite, I've been listening to your show for months now, usually while I'm doing late-night inventory work. There's something comforting about your voice echoing through the empty halls of the library, making the darkness feel less occupied. But after what happened 3 weeks ago, I can't listen anymore. Every time I hear your voice, I'm reminded of that night, and I start hearing other sounds. Sounds that shouldn't exist. I need to tell someone who might understand. Someone who won't immediately suggest I see a therapist or take a vacation. Someone who knows that some experiences can't be explained away with logic and medical degrees. It was a Tuesday night in late September. I remember because we'd just received a new acquisition, a collection of 18th century personal letters from a recently deceased estate in Lake Forest. Beautiful pieces, some still sealed with wax, the kind of discovery that makes a librarian's heart race. I was working late, cataloging the new materials in our climate-controlled rare books room on the 4th floor. The Newberry closes to the public at 5, but staff often stay much later. The building is enormous, 6 floors of reading rooms, offices, and storage areas that date back to 1893. During the day, it bustles with researchers and students. But after hours, it's a different creature entirely. The rare books room where I work is accessed through a series of keycard-controlled doors. Security is tight. We're talking millions of dollars worth of irreplaceable documents. The room itself is kept at exactly 68 degrees with 45% humidity. No natural light ever touches these materials. It's illuminated by soft, warm LED panels that cast everything in a golden glow. I was alone that night, which wasn't unusual. Dr. Patterson, our head curator, had left around 7, and Janet from Acquisitions had gone home with a migraine around 8:30. The security guard, Martinez, was making his rounds on the lower floors. I could hear his radio crackling occasionally through the building's intercom system. I was working at Station 7, one of our examination tables positioned near the 16th century manuscript section. Beautiful volumes bound in leather and vellum, some with brass clasps that have developed the most gorgeous patina over the centuries. The smell in that room, it's intoxicating. Paper and leather and time itself, if time has a scent. I'd been photographing and describing a series of letters when I first heard it. The sound of pages turning. Now that might not seem strange in a library, but remember, I was alone, and these books don't just get handled casually. Each one requires specific protocols, gloves, proper lighting, careful positioning. You don't just flip through a 400-year-old manuscript like it's a paperback novel. The sound was coming from section G7, about 30 feet to my left. Slow, deliberate page turns, the kind of careful, reverent handling you'd expect from an experienced researcher. I could even hear the whisper of aged paper against paper, that distinctive rustle that old books make. "Hello?" I called out, thinking maybe Martinez had come up to check on me. "Dr. Patterson?" Silence. I waited a moment, then returned to my work. Old buildings make noises, right? Settling foundations, temperature changes, the HVAC system cycling. The Newberry is over a century old. It probably has sounds I haven't even discovered yet. But then it happened again. Same deliberate rhythm. Page turn, pause. Page turn, pause. Like someone was reading, taking their time to absorb each page before moving on. I stood up from my workstation and walked toward section G7. The golden LED lighting cast long shadows between the stacks, creating an almost honeyed atmosphere that should have been comforting, but somehow felt heavy, expectant. As I approached the area where the sound had originated, I noticed something odd. The air felt different, thicker, and there was a smell underneath the usual library scents, something organic and slightly sweet, like flowers that had been pressed between pages for decades. Section G7 houses some of our most valuable medieval and Renaissance manuscripts. I know every volume in that section by heart. As I approached, I could see them all in their proper places, standing at attention in their custom-fitted boxes and protective sleeves. But then I saw it. One volume had been removed from its box and was lying open on the reading rest we keep positioned between the stacks. It was the Rossetti Illuminated Hours, a book of hours from approximately 1480, decorated with the most exquisite miniature paintings you've ever seen. Angels and saints rendered in gold and lapis lazuli, their faces so detailed you'd swear they were watching you. The book was open to a page I knew well, a depiction of the resurrection, showing Christ emerging from the tomb while angels looked on. But as I got closer, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The page was turning, not a fast flip, but a slow, careful lift of the edge, as if invisible fingers were gently coaxing the ancient vellum to reveal the next illustration. I watched, paralyzed, as the page completed its turn and settled against the rest of the book with the softest whisper. Now it was open to the page, showing the angel of death, a figure in black robes holding an hourglass, standing over a field of lilies. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, waiting for my rational mind to provide an explanation. Air current from the ventilation system, some kind of static electricity, a slight vibration from the building's infrastructure. Anything. But as I watched the book open to a page I'd never seen before. And that's impossible, because I've cataloged every page of the Rossetti Hours. I've photographed them, described them, studied them under magnification. I know that book like I know my own heartbeat. This page was different. The illumination style was similar, but the content, The content was a single image of a woman in a blue dress sitting at a desk surrounded by books. She had dark hair pulled back in a bun, and she was wearing glasses. Modern glasses, not anything that would have existed in 1480. She looked exactly like me. I'm not talking about a general resemblance. I'm talking about an exact likeness, down to the small scar above my left eyebrow from when I fell off my bike as a kid. The woman in the illustration was even wearing the same green cardigan I had on that night. But here's the thing that still makes my hands shake when I think about it. The woman in the illustration was looking up from her work, looking directly out of the page, and her mouth was moving. I could see her lips forming words over and over again. I leaned closer, trying to make out what she was saying, and that's when I heard it. Not with my ears, but somehow directly in my mind, like a whisper that bypassed my hearing entirely. "Don't leave me here alone." I jerked backward so fast I knocked over the reading rest, sending the book tumbling to the floor. The sound of it hitting the carpet was like a gunshot in the silence. As I scrambled to pick it up, my hands shaking so badly I could barely function, the book fell open to its proper page, the Angel of Death illustration. There was no mysterious woman, no modern dress or glasses or scar above an eyebrow. Just the traditional medieval imagery I'd seen hundreds of times before. I carefully closed the book and returned it to its protective box, my hands trembling the entire time. Then I gathered my things, locked up the room, and left the building. I didn't finish my cataloging work. I didn't even turn off the lights properly. I just ran. The next morning I came in early to check on the Rossetti hours. Everything was exactly as it should be. The book was properly stored. All the pages accounted for. No damage from its fall. Dr. Patterson complimented me on completing the previous night's inventory so efficiently. According to the work logs, I'd finished cataloging the entire new acquisition and had even completed the preliminary condition reports on 12 additional volumes. I had no memory of doing any of that work. But here's what really haunts me, Mr. Cronkite. 3 weeks later, I'm still hearing pages turning, not just at work, but at home. In my apartment at night, I'll be reading or watching television, and I'll hear that same careful, deliberate rhythm coming from my bedroom. Page turn, pause, page turn, pause. When I investigate, I never find anything out of place. But sometimes on my bedside table, I'll find books I don't remember taking out from the library, books that aren't even in our circulation system. Old volumes with no call numbers, no acquisition stamps, no catalog records. And sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed trying to sleep, I can feel someone watching me. Not threatening exactly, but expectant. Like they're waiting for me to read to them or with them. Like they don't want to be alone with all those words, all those stories, all that accumulated knowledge. I've started sleeping with the lights on, Mr. Cronkite, because in the dark, I can hear them clearly now. Not just one set of pages turning, but dozens. A whole library's worth of books being read by people who are no longer there to read them. Last night, I woke up to find a piece of paper on my nightstand. Written in my own handwriting, though I have no memory of writing it, were the words, "The books remember everyone who ever loved them. They don't like to be forgotten." I don't know what to do. I love my job. I love those books, but I'm starting to think they love me back in a way that isn't healthy. In a way that doesn't want to let me go. If you read this on the air, Mr. Cronkite, please don't use my last name. The Newberry Library is a prestigious institution, and they don't need rumors of hauntings affecting their reputation. But if there are other librarians out there experiencing similar things, I'd like them to know they're not alone. We're not alone, even when we think we are, especially when we think we are. Sincerely, Grace. Well, Grace, I want you to know that your letter reached me, and more importantly, I believe every word of it. There's something about institutions of learning, especially the old ones, that seems to accumulate more than just knowledge. They accumulate the passion, the dedication, the love that people have poured into those books and documents over the decades. I did some research after receiving your letter, Grace, and I discovered something interesting about the Newberry Library. In 1952, a librarian named Dorothy Meredith was found deceased at her desk in the rare books room after working late one evening. Natural causes, according to the reports. A heart attack brought on by stress. She had been cataloging a new acquisition of medieval manuscripts. The interesting thing is, Dorothy was known for her habit of talking to the books while she worked. Colleagues often heard her having full conversations in the rare books room, discussing the history of each piece, commenting on the craftsmanship of the illuminations. They found it charming, if a bit eccentric. After her death, several staff members reported hearing voices in the rare books room during evening hours. Soft conversations, as if someone was still commenting on the manuscripts. The reports eventually stopped, but they lasted for nearly a year. Grace, I can't tell you whether what you experienced was Dorothy trying to continue her work, or simply the building holding on to echoes of all the love and dedication that's been poured into it over the decades. But I can tell you this, if the books are indeed remembering everyone who ever loved them, then you're in good company. The fog's rolling in thick tonight, listeners. I can barely see the tree line from the studio window. It's the kind of night when the boundary between our world and whatever lies beyond seems particularly thin. We've got more stories coming your way, tales from the archives, from the stacks, from the quiet corners where knowledge sleeps and dreams. Stay with us. The night is young, and the books are just beginning to whisper their secrets. You're listening to WNNMR, Nocturnal Mysteries Radio. I'm Edward Cronkite, and we'll be right back after these messages from our sponsors. We're back, night owls. The static's been playing up tonight. I keep hearing whispers between the frequencies, voices that seem to fade just as I tune in closer. Must be the atmospheric pressure from this storm system moving in from the northwest. Or maybe it's something else entirely. You never can tell out here in the deep woods. I've been getting calls during the break, folks. Seems Grace's story from the Newberry Library struck a nerve with quite a few of you. My phone hasn't stopped ringing. Librarians, archivists, even a few museum curators sharing their own encounters with the restless spirits that seem drawn to places of learning and memory. One caller particularly caught my attention. He wouldn't give his name over the phone, just said he worked maintenance at one of Boston's oldest libraries, and that he had a story that would make Grace's experience look like bedtime reading. Before I could ask for details, the line went dead. But 20 minutes later, I found an email waiting in my inbox from someone calling himself VM. The message was brief. Mr. Cronkite, I heard the Chicago librarian's story. I work at the Boston Athenaeum. What happened to me makes her book turning seem quaint. I'll call you at 2 a.m. if you want the full story. Don't try to trace this email. V. Well, VM, you've got my attention. And since it's now 20 past midnight, I figure I'll share what you sent me in a follow-up message, along with the recording of our call that came in right on schedule at 2 a.m. sharp. For those unfamiliar with the Boston Athenaeum, we're talking about one of America's oldest independent libraries, founded in 1807. This isn't some modern glass and steel structure. It's a genuine 19th century temple to knowledge, complete with narrow staircases, hidden alcoves, and rooms that seem to exist outside of normal architectural logic. The kind of place where shadows have weight and silence has texture. VM, who I'm going to call Victor for tonight's broadcast, has been the lead electrical maintenance technician there for 8 years. He knows every wire, every circuit, every forgotten corner of that labyrinthine building. At least he thought he did. Here's what Victor sent me, followed by excerpts from our phone conversation.
Cronkite, I'm a practical man, 35 years old, Navy electrician before this job, father of 2 girls. I believe in what I can see, touch, and measure with instruments. Voltage doesn't lie. Amperage doesn't play tricks. Electrical systems follow laws that don't change based on mood or imagination. But I can't explain what's been happening in the memento room. Let me back up. The Athenaeum has several special collections rooms, but the memento room is different. It's on the 4th floor, tucked away behind a door that most visitors never notice. The room houses personal papers, diaries, letters, photographs, donated by families over the decades. Items too personal for the main collections, but too historically significant to discard. The room itself is maybe 15 by 20 feet, with tall windows that face west toward the common. Heavy burgundy curtains keep the light from damaging the documents. Gas fixtures from the 1890s were converted to electricity decades ago, but they still use those old Edison-style bulbs that cast everything in warm amber light. 3 weeks ago, I got a work order to check the electrical in that room. Complaints about flickering lights and a ventilation fan that was running constantly, even when the thermostat should have shut it off. Simple diagnostic work, or so I thought. I went up there after closing time. That's when I do most of my work in the special collections areas. Fewer people around, less chance of disturbing researchers or damaging sensitive materials. The Athenaeum closes to the public at 8, but staff access continues until 10 for special projects. I unlocked the memento room around 8:30 that Tuesday evening. The moment I stepped inside, I knew something was off. The air felt thick, humid, despite the climate control system running perfectly. And there was a smell, not unpleasant exactly, but strange, like old perfume mixed with something organic, flowers left too long in water. I set up my testing equipment and started checking the light fixtures. The wiring was old, but in good condition, properly grounded, no sign of shorts or overloads. The flickering issue wasn't immediately apparent. The lights were steady and bright as I worked. That's when I noticed the ventilation fan. It was running, which wasn't unusual. But the sound it was making, instead of the steady hum you'd expect from a properly functioning motor, it was producing a rhythmic pulsing, almost like breathing. Slow, deep breaths, with a slight wheeze on the exhale. I shut off the breaker and climbed up to examine the fan housing. Nothing wrong with the motor or the blades. I cleaned the mechanism, checked the belt tension, verified the electrical connections. Everything was perfect. But when I turned the power back on, that breathing sound returned immediately. I was puzzling over this when I heard something else. A rustling sound, like someone moving through papers. I looked around the room. The document cases were all closed and locked. The reading table was clear except for my tools. But the sound continued. Soft, deliberate movements, as if someone was carefully going through old letters or diary pages. "Hello?" I called out. "Security?" The rustling stopped immediately. But in the silence that followed, I could hear something else, something that made the hair on my arms stand up. Breathing. Not the mechanical wheeze from the ventilation fan. This was human breathing, slow, measured, coming from somewhere near the windows. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the room. The beam passed over document cases, reading chairs, a small table with a brass reading lamp. Everything exactly where it should be. But as the light moved across the far corner near the windows, I saw something that shouldn't have been there. A shadow. Not cast by any object in the room, not created by the angle of my flashlight. This was a shadow with dimension, standing independently near the heavy curtains. The outline of a person, average height, wearing what looked like a long coat or dress from an earlier era. I kept the flashlight beam on the shadow, expecting it to resolve into something logical, a coat rack I'd forgotten, a mannequin used for displaying period clothing. But the shadow didn't behave like a normal shadow. It moved. Slowly, deliberately, the shadow figure turned toward me. I couldn't make out features. It was more like a dark silhouette cut out of the air itself, but I had the distinct impression it was looking at me, studying me. That's when the breathing sound intensified. Not louder exactly, but more present. As if whoever was breathing had moved closer. I should have left. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to pack up my tools and get out of that room. But I'm stubborn, and I was curious. 8 years in that building, and I'd never experienced anything I couldn't explain. I took a step toward the shadow. It retreated, moving smoothly along the wall toward the document cases. As it moved, I heard something new, the soft sound of papers being handled. Not roughly, but with the careful attention of someone accustomed to working with fragile materials. I followed, keeping my flashlight trained on the shadow. It led me to a specific document case, one I'd never paid much attention to before. The placard read, "Personal Correspondence, Dorothea M. Harrison, 1895 to 1923. The shadow stopped in front of this case and seemed to be pointing at something inside. I looked closer and noticed that one of the document folders was slightly askew, as if it had been recently handled. That's when the light started flickering. Not the steady electrical flicker you get from a loose connection. This was rhythmic, deliberate. 3 quick flashes, pause, 3 more flashes, like someone was sending a signal. I looked back at the shadow, but it was gone. The breathing sound had stopped. Even the ventilation fan had returned to its normal steady hum. But I could feel a presence in the room. Something watching, waiting. I finished my electrical work quickly, tightened a few connections, replaced an aging switch. The whole time, I had the sensation of being observed, not malevolently, but with intense curiosity, as if whatever was in that room was trying to understand why I was there. As I was packing up my tools, I heard one final sound, a whisper, so soft, I almost missed it. "Thank you for noticing." I looked around the room one more time, but I was definitely alone, at least visibly alone. I reported the electrical issues as resolved and didn't mention the other things I'd experienced. What would I say? That I'd had a conversation with a shadow? That the ventilation fan was breathing? But I couldn't stop thinking about that document case. Dorothea M. Harrison. The name stuck with me. The next day I did some research. Dorothea Harrison had been a volunteer at the Athenaeum from 1920 until her death in 1923. She worked primarily with the personal papers collection, helping to organize and preserve family documents that had been donated to the library. According to the records I found, she died of tuberculosis at the age of 28. The interesting thing was she died in the library. She'd been working late one evening cataloging a new donation of Civil War letters when she collapsed. They found her the next morning at the reading table in what is now the memento room, surrounded by the documents she'd been organizing. The cause of death was listed as respiratory failure due to tuberculosis, but witnesses noted that she seemed to have passed peacefully. as if she'd simply laid her head down to rest. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, I've been back to the memento room 4 times for various maintenance issues. Each time, I've encountered the same phenomena: the breathing ventilation fan, the rustling of papers, the shadow that moves independently of any light source. But I've also started noticing other things: documents that have been moved slightly between visits, reading chairs positioned differently, and always that sense of being watched by someone who means no harm, who might even be grateful for the company. Last week I brought my digital recorder with me. Thought I might capture some evidence of the sounds I'd been hearing. When I played back the recording later, there were long stretches of normal ambient noise punctuated by something extraordinary. Whispered words, barely audible but clearly articulated. These letters, they need to be preserved. Their stories matter. The voice was female, young, with a slight rasp that could have been caused by respiratory illness. I think Dorothea Harrison is still working in that room, Mr. Cronkite, still caring for those personal papers, still making sure the stories of ordinary people don't get lost or forgotten. And I think she's been trying to show me which documents need the most attention, which collections might be deteriorating. Because here's the thing: every time I've encountered her shadow, every document case she's led me to has turned out to need conservation work. Papers that were beginning to show signs of acid deterioration, photographs that were starting to fade, letters whose ink was becoming unstable. It's like she's still doing her job, even after a century, still protecting the memories that people entrusted to the library.
That was Victor's written account, folks. But our phone conversation at 2 a.m. revealed even more disturbing details. Here's what he told me when I pressed him for more information. Cronkite, I haven't told you the worst part yet. Last night I was in the memento room replacing some outlet covers when I heard her breathing again. But this time, it sounded labored, struggling. I looked around for the shadow, but instead I saw something else. Condensation was forming on the windows, despite the climate control keeping the humidity constant. And in the condensation, as if someone was tracing with their finger, words were appearing: "Help them before they fade away." I rushed over to see which document case she was indicating this time, and found something that chilled me to the bone. The Dorothea Harrison collection, her own papers, were showing severe signs of deterioration. Her personal diary, her letters, her photographs. Everything that proved she'd existed was slowly crumbling away. I think she's not just caring for other people's memories anymore, Cronkite. I think she's fighting to preserve her own existence, and I'm starting to worry about what happens if those documents are lost completely. What happens to a spirit whose anchor to this world is dissolving? The line went quiet for a long moment before Victor continued. There's something else. Tonight, before I called you, I went back to check on her collection one more time. The room was empty, but the breathing sound was stronger than ever. And when I looked at the windows, there were dozens of handprints in the condensation. Small hands, like a child's or a young woman's. All of them pressed against the glass like someone was trying to get out, or trying to get our attention before it's too late. Victor, if you're listening, I want you to know that I've reached out to some contacts in the archival preservation community. There are people who specialize in emergency conservation of deteriorating documents, and I've given them the Athenaeum's contact information. Sometimes the living need to step in to help the dead complete their unfinished business. But I have to ask our listeners something. How many of you work in libraries, museums, or archives where the collections include personal papers? Diaries, letters, photographs, the intimate memories of people long past? And how many of you have noticed that these collections seem to require more attention, more care, as if someone was still looking after them? Because I'm starting to think that our repositories of human memory are more active than we realize. That the people who devoted their lives to preserving these materials don't simply disappear when their physical forms give out. They continue their work in whatever way they can, trying to ensure that the stories they protected in life don't vanish into obscurity. The rain's really coming down now, and I can hear something rattling against the studio windows, probably just branches from the old oak tree. But in this business, you learn not to dismiss sounds too quickly. They might be trying to tell you something important. We've got more stories from the stacks coming up, including a particularly unsettling account from our nation's capital, a tale of wet fingerprints on security vault handles and voices breathing secrets into empty rooms. Stay close to your radios, folks. The night's far from over, and the librarians have much more to share. This is Edward Cronkite, and you're listening to WNMR, Nocturnal Mysteries Radio, broadcasting live from the heart of the Blackwood Forest. We'll return after this brief message. The coffee pot's making that gurgling sound again, folks. Always happens around this time of night, like it's trying to tell me something through the percolation. I've learned to pay attention to these small disturbances during the late hours. Sometimes they're mechanical issues, sometimes they're atmospheric pressure changes, and sometimes there's something else entirely. It's now approaching 1:30 in the morning, and the calls haven't stopped coming in. I've got a stack of emails here that's growing taller by the minute, all from people who work in the quiet corners of our cultural institutions. Seems like Grace and Victor's stories have opened a floodgate of experiences that people have been keeping to themselves for years. But there's one message that arrived just moments ago that I knew I had to share with you tonight. It came through our secure submission portal, the one we use for particularly sensitive stories, and it's from someone who works in perhaps the most secure library environment in the country. The sender identifies herself only as SK, and she works at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. For those who've never been there, we're talking about the largest library in the world, housing over 170 million items across 3 massive buildings. But more importantly for tonight's discussion, it's home to some of the most restricted and carefully preserved documents in human history. SK works in what she calls the deep storage facility, areas of the Jefferson Building that most visitors never see, where the most valuable and fragile materials are kept under museum-quality conditions. Security clearances, biometric scanners, climate-controlled vaults that can only be opened by 2 people working in tandem. This is where they keep the documents that are literally irreplaceable. But sometimes, even in the most secure environments, the past finds a way to make its presence known. Here's what SK sent me.
Mr. Cronkite, I heard your show tonight while working a late shift in the Asian Collections Preservation Vault. Victor's story about the breathing in the ventilation system struck a nerve. We've been having similar issues down here, though what I experienced goes far beyond mysterious sounds. My name is Sophie, and I'm 27 years old. I've been working as an archival preservation specialist at the Library of Congress for 4 years now. I have security clearance to access Level 7 restricted materials, documents so rare and valuable that they're kept in individual climate-controlled compartments, some of which haven't been opened in decades. 3 months ago, I was assigned to conduct a condition assessment on a collection of documents from the Nguyen Dynasty of Vietnam, dating from 1802 to 1945. These materials came to the library through a complex diplomatic arrangement in 1978, and they've been in deep storage ever since. Imperial edicts, personal correspondence from Emperor Minmong, court records written on traditional paper with lacquered seals still intact. The collection is housed in Vault C-47, 6 floors below ground level in the Jefferson Building. To access it, I need to pass through 4 separate security checkpoints, including a biometric scanner that reads both fingerprints and retinal patterns. The vault itself is a room about the size of a large closet, with humidity maintained at exactly 35% and temperature held constant at 65 degrees Fahrenheit. The lighting in these vaults is motion-activated LED, designed to minimize exposure to harmful spectrums while providing adequate illumination for detailed work. There's no outside communication once you're sealed inside. Electromagnetic shielding prevents cell phone signals, and there's no internet connection. Just you, the documents, and the soft hum of the environmental controls. I went down to Vault C-47 on a Tuesday evening in late September. The building was nearly empty, just security staff and a few researchers with special after-hours access working in the main reading rooms. I prefer doing my preservation assessments during off hours because there are fewer vibrations from foot traffic and the building's environmental systems run more steadily. The vault door is a massive thing, maybe 3 inches thick, with a handle that requires both my key card and a physical key turned simultaneously. As I approached that evening, I noticed something odd. The handle was wet, not just damp from condensation, actually wet, as if someone with dripping hands had just grabbed it. In an environment maintained at 35% humidity, this was unusual enough to make me pause. I examined the handle more closely with my flashlight and saw something that made my stomach drop. Clear fingerprints, still wet. Covering the entire surface of the handle, full handprints, as if someone had grabbed it with both hands and held on. The thing is, according to the access logs, I was the first person to enter that vault in 6 weeks. The previous visitor had been Dr. Martinez from the Asian Studies Department, and that had been for a routine security inspection, not document handling. I dried off the handle and opened the vault, checking the humidity and temperature readings before entering. Everything was normal. Environment stable, no signs of moisture intrusion, air filtration system functioning perfectly. The Nguyen Dynasty documents are stored in 15 custom-made archival boxes, each one equipped with its own humidity monitoring system. I began my assessment with Box 1, which contains imperial correspondence from 1820 to 1835. I was about 15 minutes into my work when I heard it. A sound like water dripping, very slow and rhythmic. Drip, drip, drip. I looked around the small vault, but there was no visible water source. The sound seemed to be coming from above, from the direction of the air circulation system. I continued working, but the dripping sound persisted. And after about 20 minutes, I noticed something else. The documents I was examining, 200-year-old papers that should have been completely dry, felt slightly damp to the touch. This was alarming enough that I immediately checked the humidity monitors. All readings were normal, exactly where they should be, but the papers continued to feel damp, and the dripping sound was getting more frequent. That's when I noticed the footprints. On the pristine white floor of the vault, there were wet footprints leading from the door to the document storage area. Bare feet, small, like those of a young woman or teenager. The prints were fresh. I could see individual toe marks clearly defined in the moisture. I followed the trail with my eyes and realized they led directly to Box 7, which contained personal items and correspondence from the Imperial Court's female quarters. Documents written by the wives and daughters of the emperors. Poetry. Personal letters, records of daily life in the forbidden purple city of Hue. I opened box 7 with trembling hands. The documents inside were not just damp, they were soaking wet, as if they'd been submerged in water. But when I lifted them out, they were completely dry to the touch. It was like looking at wet paper while feeling dry paper, a sensory disconnect that made me question my own perception. As I examined the documents more closely, I noticed something written in the margin of one of the letters. Modern pencil writing, in English, in handwriting I didn't recognize. I am still here. They promised to remember me. I checked that document against our digital catalog. According to our records, that margin had been blank when the item was last photographed for digitization 3 years ago. The dripping sound was becoming more insistent now, and I could see water beginning to pool on the floor around my feet, though I couldn't determine where it was coming from. The environmental controls showed no irregularities, but my work area was getting noticeably wetter. I decided to expedite my assessment and move to the final boxes, but as I reached for box 15, I heard something that stopped me cold. Crying. Soft, heartbroken sobbing coming from somewhere inside the vault. A young woman's voice, crying with the kind of grief that comes from profound loss. The sound echoed off the walls despite the acoustic dampening built into the vault's construction. I stood perfectly still, listening, trying to locate the source of the sound. It seemed to be coming from the documents themselves, as if the papers were weeping. Then I heard words, spoken in Vietnamese, which I don't understand, but the emotional content was unmistakable. Pleading, desperate, the voice of someone trying to make themselves understood across a vast distance. I grabbed my phone to try to record the voice, forgetting that there was no signal in the vault. But as I raised the phone, the crying stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the weeping had been. That's when I saw her. Reflected in the black screen of my phone, standing directly behind me, was a young Vietnamese woman in traditional imperial court dress. She couldn't have been more than 16 or 17, with long black hair and eyes that held a depth of sadness I'd never seen before. I spun around, but there was no one there. The vault was empty, except for me and the documents. But when I looked back at my phone screen, she was still there in the reflection, and now she was pointing at box 15. I opened the box she was indicating and found a collection of personal letters written by Princess Ngoc, the youngest daughter of Emperor Minmong. She had died in 1838 at the age of 17, according to the documentation, but the cause of death was listed simply as grief illness, a term that could mean anything from tuberculosis to heartbreak. The letters were written to her brother, Prince Khan, who had been sent away from court for political reasons. In them, she begged him to return, described her loneliness, expressed her fear that she would be forgotten after her death. The final letter, dated just days before she died, contained a line that made my hands shake. I will wait here among my words until someone remembers to look for me. As I read this, the water on the floor began to recede, the dripping sound faded, and the oppressive humidity in the vault returned to normal. But written in the condensation on the inside of the vault door, in the same modern handwriting I'd seen in the margins, were new words. Thank you for reading my letters. Please don't let them forget me again. I finished my assessment quickly and sealed the vault. When I checked the access logs the next morning, they showed that the vault had been opened twice that evening. Once when I entered, and once again at 3:17 a.m., 20 minutes after I'd left the building. The security cameras for that level were mysteriously corrupted for a 12-hour period that night. But here's what really haunts me, Mr. Cronkite. I've been back to that vault 6 times since then for various projects. Each time, I find new writing in the margins of Princess Ngaklan's letters. Not historical editions, modern notes in English describing her life in the court, her relationships with her family, details about daily life in Imperial Vietnam that aren't recorded anywhere else in our collections. It's as if she's continuing to tell her story, adding to the historical record because she knows that someone is finally paying attention. The latest edition, which I found just last week, simply said, "My story matters. All of our stories matter. Please help them understand." I've started advocating for a full digitization project of the Nguyen Dynasty collection, with special emphasis on the documents from the women's quarters. My supervisors are puzzled by my sudden, passionate interest in 19th century Vietnamese court records, but they've approved preliminary funding for the project. I think Princess Ngoc Lan is still trying to ensure that the women of her time aren't forgotten by history, that their voices are preserved and heard, even if it takes nearly 2 centuries for someone to listen. But I'm also starting to worry about the other collections in our deep storage vaults. How many other voices are down there, waiting in the darkness for someone to remember they exist? How many stories are being told to empty rooms, hoping that eventually someone will come to listen? Last night, I heard crying coming from 3 different vaults on level 7. And this morning, I found wet handprints on the handles of doors that haven't been opened in months. I think they're all trying to tell us something, Mr. Cronkite, all these preserved voices from the past. And I'm starting to think that our job as archivists isn't just to preserve their documents. It's to make sure their stories continue to be told. Sincerely, Sophie.
Sophie, I want you to know that your work matters more than you might realize. What you're experiencing in those vaults isn't just a supernatural phenomenon. It's a reminder of the responsibility we bear to the voices from the past. Every document in those collections represents a life lived, a story told, a person who hoped their words would outlast their physical existence. I did some research on Princess Ngoc Lan after receiving your message, and what I found was troubling. Despite being the daughter of one of Vietnam's most significant emperors, there are virtually no English-language historical records about her life. Her existence is mentioned in passing in a few academic papers, but her voice, her perspective, her experiences, they've been largely lost to time, until now. If she's indeed continuing to add to the historical record through those margin notes, then you may be witnessing something unprecedented, a collaboration between the living and the dead to ensure that forgotten stories are finally told. But Sophie, I have to ask you to be careful down there in those vaults. The wet handprints, the crying from multiple locations. It sounds like you may have awakened something larger than just one lonely princess. You might want to document everything you're experiencing and consider sharing it with your supervisors, regardless of how it might sound. Because sometimes the best way to help the dead find peace is to ensure their stories reach the living. The wind's picking up again outside the station, and I can hear it whistling through the transmitter cables. There's something almost musical about it tonight, like voices carried on the air from very far away. Makes me wonder what stories the wind might be trying to tell, what messages it might be carrying from places where the past still lives and breathes. We've got more tales from the stacks coming your way, including a rather disturbing account from a book cart that seems to travel through library halls of its own accord, and a story about the color of ink that refuses to dry. Keep those coffee cups full and your radios close, folks. We're only just scratching the surface of the mysteries that dwell in our temples of knowledge. This is Edward Cronkite on WNMR, Nocturnal Mysteries Radio. We'll be right back with more whispers from the archives. You know what I love about this job, folks? The stories find their way to me even when I'm not actively looking for them. Right now, as I'm speaking to you through this old microphone in our forest studio, I've got 17 new emails that arrived just in the past hour. Word is spreading through the library community faster than I expected, and the accounts are getting more detailed, more personal, and frankly more unsettling. It's 2:15 in the morning now, and I just finished a fascinating phone call with someone who works at one of California's most prestigious research libraries. He wouldn't give his full name, said he was worried about his job security, but he agreed to let me share his story as long as I called him Carter. Now, Carter works at the Huntington Library in San Marino, California. For those not familiar with it, the Huntington isn't just a library, it's a research institution, art gallery, and botanical garden all rolled into one. Founded by railroad magnate Henry Huntington in 1919, it houses some of the most important manuscripts and rare books in the western United States. We're talking about Gutenberg Bibles, Chaucer manuscripts, the entire personal library of British scholars dating back centuries. But what makes Carter's story particularly intriguing is where it takes place. The Huntington has a section called the Scholars Hall, a series of connected rooms and corridors where researchers can access materials for extended study periods. These halls were designed in the 1920s to mimic the feeling of walking through a medieval monastery, complete with stone archways, wooden reading desks, and oil paintings of long-dead benefactors watching over the scholarship below. It's in these halls during the deepest part of the night shift that Carter encountered something that's been keeping him awake for the past month. Let me share what he told me.
Mr. Cronkite, I appreciate you taking my call so late. I know this sounds crazy, but I needed to tell someone who might understand what I've been experiencing. I'm 32 years old, and I've been working at the Huntington for almost 6 years now. I'm what they call a collections associate. I handle the transportation and organization of materials for researchers, maintain the reading rooms, and do security rounds during the overnight hours. It's peaceful work, mostly. The kind of job where you develop a real relationship with the books and the spaces they inhabit. My favorite part of the job is the late-night book cart runs. We have researchers who work on projects that require dozens of volumes, and sometimes those materials need to be moved between different study areas depending on security requirements and availability. I usually do these transfers between midnight and 4 a.m. when the halls are empty and there's no risk of disturbing scholars. The book cart I use is an old wooden one, probably from the 1940s. Heavy oak construction with brass fittings and wheels that have developed a distinctive squeak over the decades. It can hold about 50 volumes safely, and it moves with the kind of solid, purposeful weight that you associate with quality craftsmanship. 3 weeks ago, I was doing a routine transfer of medieval manuscript reproductions from the Scholars Hall to the Renaissance Study Room. It was around 2 a.m., and the building was completely empty except for security and myself. These late-night transfers are usually my favorite part of the job. There's something almost meditative about moving through those quiet halls with a cart full of knowledge, like you're participating in an ancient tradition of preserving human learning. The route from Scholars Hall to the Renaissance Room takes you through what we call the Portrait Corridor, a long hallway lined with oil paintings of the library's founders and major benefactors. Henry Huntington himself is there, along with various scholars and philanthropists who've contributed to the collection over the decades. Their eyes seem to follow you as you pass, which can be unnerving late at night, but you get used to it. I was about halfway through the corridor when I heard it. A voice, deep and resonant, coming from somewhere behind me. "Please continue reading to us." I stopped the cart immediately and turned around. The corridor was empty. just the portraits looking down with their painted eyes. But the voice had been clear, unmistakably human, and it had sounded like a request rather than a command. "Hello?" I called out softly. "Security?" No response. Just the soft hum of the climate control system and the distant sound of traffic from the San Marino streets outside. I was about to continue when I heard it again, this time from a different direction. "We've been waiting so long to hear the stories again." The voice was definitely male, elderly, with the kind of cultured accent you might associate with 1920s academia. It seemed to be coming from the books themselves, as if one of the volumes on my cart was speaking. I looked down at the materials I was transporting. They were reproductions of illuminated manuscripts, the Book of Kells, various psalters, some French poetry from the 14th century. Beautiful works, but just photocopies and digitally printed versions, not originals that might carry some kind of spiritual residue. That's when I noticed something odd. One of the books, a reproduction of the Lindisfarne Gospels, was lying open on the cart, its pages fluttering slightly as if moved by a breeze. But there was no air current in the corridor. The climate control keeps everything perfectly still to prevent damage to sensitive materials. I approached the cart carefully and looked down at the open book. It was displaying a page I'd never noticed before, though I'd handled this particular reproduction dozens of times. The page showed an illuminated letter R, decorated with intricate Celtic knotwork, but underneath the traditional design, there appeared to be additional text written in the margins, modern text in English, written in pencil. My name was Brother Thomas of Lindisfarne. I copied this page in the year of our Lord 1147. I have been waiting for someone to read my words aloud again. Please, don't let my work be forgotten. I stared at the page, my heart pounding. This was impossible. These were modern reproductions printed from digital files. There shouldn't be any handwritten editions, especially not ones claiming to be from medieval monks. But as I watched, more text began to appear in the margins, as if an invisible hand was writing, "We are all here, all of us who poured our lives into these pages, the scribes, the illuminators, the scholars who preserved these works through dark ages and wars. We live on in the words we copied, the knowledge we saved. But we need to be remembered. We need our stories to be told." The voice came again, this time seeming to emanate from multiple directions. "Read to us, friend. Help us remember who we were." I looked around the corridor and realized something that made my skin crawl. The painted eyes in all the portraits were no longer looking down the hallway as they normally did. They were all turned toward me, watching expectantly. Without really understanding why, I began to read aloud from the open page of the Lindisfarne Gospels. Not the traditional Latin text, but the new writing that had appeared in the margins. I was born in Northumbria in the year 1121. My father was a stonecutter. My mother died when I was 7. I came to the monastery because I had a gift for letters, and the abbot said God needed scribes as much as he needed soldiers. I spent 43 years copying sacred texts, and I never once considered my work finished. There was always another manuscript to preserve, another piece of knowledge to save from being lost. As I read, I could feel a presence gathering around me, not threatening, but intensely attentive, like an audience hanging on every word. The air in the corridor grew warmer, more substantial, as if it was being filled with the breath of listeners. I continued reading, and more text continued to appear. My name was Sister Margaret of the Convent of St. Clare. I illuminated manuscripts for 31 years, painting gold leaf angels and decorating prayer books for nobles who never knew my name. I mixed my own pigments from lapis lazuli and ground pearls, and I signed my work with tiny symbols hidden in the decorative borders. Look for the small roses. They are my signature, my way of saying I was here. The voice that had originally spoken to me now said more clearly than before, "She's here with us." They're all here. Every scribe, every illuminator, every scholar who dedicated their life to preserving knowledge. They exist in the margins of history, in the spaces between the famous names and the great events. But their work, their devotion to learning, that's what allowed human knowledge to survive. I spent the next hour in that corridor, reading aloud from text that continued to appear in the reproduction manuscripts. Stories of medieval monks working by candlelight, of scribes in Islamic libraries preserving Greek philosophy, of Chinese scholars hand-copying poetry during times of war. Each voice distinct, each story personal and human. But here's what really shook me, Mr. Cronkite. When I finally finished and continued to the Renaissance room to deliver the books, I checked each volume carefully. All the handwritten margin notes were gone. The pages were clean, exactly as they should be for modern reproductions. But I know what I read. I know what I heard. And I've started to understand something about this place, about all places where knowledge is preserved and studied. The dead don't really leave us, especially not those who devoted their lives to learning and teaching. They become part of the institution, part of the living memory of human scholarship. They wait in the quiet hours, hoping someone will remember their contributions, their sacrifices, their love for the written word. Since that night, I've been doing my cart rounds differently. I read aloud as I work, sharing stories from the books I'm transporting. And every time, I feel that presence, grateful, attentive, hungry for the sound of words being spoken with respect and understanding. Last week, I found a note tucked into one of the book cart's drawers, written in the same handwriting I'd seen in the manuscript margins. Thank you for remembering us. Thank you for understanding that every book is a collaboration between the living and the dead, between those who wrote and those who preserved, between past voices and present readers. Keep reading to us. Keep our stories alive. I think that's what libraries really are, Mr. Cronkite. They're not just repositories of information. They're communities of souls, the authors, the scribes, the librarians, the readers, all connected across time by their shared love of knowledge and story. And I think some of us, when our time comes, choose to stay with the books rather than move on to whatever comes next. Because the work of preserving human knowledge and wisdom is never really finished.
Carter, I have to say, your experience resonates with something I've been thinking about all night as these stories have been coming in. Every book, every manuscript, every document, they're not just ink on paper. They're the crystallized thoughts and dreams of human beings who believed their words were important enough to preserve. And perhaps, in the deepest sense, they were right. Perhaps consciousness itself can become embedded in the act of creation, in the careful preservation of knowledge. Perhaps that's why these institutions feel so alive during the quiet hours, because they are alive in ways we're only beginning to understand. I did some research on the Huntington's history after speaking with you, Carter, and I discovered something interesting. In 1923, just a few years after the library opened, the staff reported a series of incidents involving books that seemed to rearrange themselves overnight. Volumes would be found in different locations from where they'd been left, always organized in ways that made scholarly sense, but that no human had arranged. The incident stopped after the staff started leaving research notes out for the night scholars, as they came to call them. Simple descriptions of ongoing projects, requests for specific materials, acknowledgments of the work being done by invisible hands. Maybe that tradition is worth reviving, Carter. Maybe all our libraries and archives should acknowledge the presence of those who came before, who built these institutions with their devotion and continue to tend them with their eternal commitment to preserving human knowledge. The storm outside is intensifying now, and I can hear the wind carrying what sounds almost like chanting through the trees. Medieval Latin, maybe, or perhaps just the sound of leaves rustling in ancient rhythms. It's the kind of night when the boundaries between past and present feel particularly thin. We've got more stories from the stacks coming your way, including a particularly unsettling tale about ink that refuses to dry, and a manuscript that may be writing itself. But first, let me remind you that if you work in a library, archive, or museum and you've had experiences you can't explain, we want to hear from you. Send your stories to our secure submission portal. Because tonight has shown me that these institutions are far more active than most people realize, and the guardians of human knowledge may be more numerous than we ever imagined. Stay with us, night owls. The darkness holds many more secrets, and the books are just beginning to whisper their truths. This is Edward Cronkite, and you're listening to WNNMR, Nocturnal Mysteries Radio, broadcasting from deep in the heart of the Blackwood Forest. We'll return with more tales from beyond the stacks in just a moment. Well, it seems like word has truly gotten out into the scholarly community, folks. My email server just crashed from the volume of messages coming in, and our phone hasn't stopped ringing since we went live tonight. I've got librarians, archivists, and preservation specialists from coast to coast sharing experiences that range from mildly unsettling to absolutely terrifying. It's now 3 a.m, and there's one message that just arrived via courier. Yes, an actual paper letter delivered by hand to our remote station in the middle of the night that demands immediate attention. The delivery person wouldn't give their name, just handed over a thick envelope sealed with what appears to be genuine sealing wax, and disappeared back into the darkness before I could ask any questions. The letter is from someone who works at perhaps the most prestigious Shakespeare research facility in the world, the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. For those unfamiliar, the Folger houses the world's largest collection of Shakespearean materials, including 82 copies of the First Folio and thousands of manuscripts from the Elizabethan and Jacobean periods. The sender identifies herself as Emily, and she works in manuscript conservation, one of the most delicate and specialized fields in library science. These are the people who quite literally bring centuries-old documents back from the brink of destruction, using techniques that are part science, part art, and part pure intuition. But Emily's letter suggests that sometimes the manuscripts themselves participate in their own restoration in ways that defy all scientific explanation. The handwriting in this letter is precise but shaky, and there are water stains on several pages that could be tears or something else entirely. Let me read you what Emily shared.
Dear Mr. Cronkite, I'm writing this by hand because I don't trust digital communication for what I'm about to tell you. I've been listening to your show tonight through earphones while working late in the conservation lab, and the stories your listeners have shared mirror experiences I've been having for the past 2 months. My name is Emily, I'm 30 years old, and I've been a manuscript conservator at the Folger Shakespeare Library for 7 years. I specialize in Elizabethan and Jacobean period documents, the kind of materials that require extreme care and often months of painstaking work to restore. Conservation work is typically done in isolation, often during evening hours when the building is quiet and the environmental conditions are most stable. It's meditative work. You develop an intimate relationship with each document, learning its history not just through research, but through the physical evidence preserved in the paper. Ink and binding. 2 months ago, I was assigned to work on a manuscript that had been in our collection since 1952, but had never been properly conserved. It was a hand-copied collection of Elizabethan poetry, probably from around 1590, bound in vellum with iron gall ink that had begun to corrode the paper. The manuscript had been damaged in a fire sometime in the 18th century, leaving several pages partially burned and the text barely legible. The piece came to us through a private estate donation with very little provenance information. No attribution to a specific scribe or original owner, no indication of where it had been housed for the past 4 centuries. Just a note from the donor saying it had been in the family for generations and that they hoped we could give it the care it deserves. I began work on the manuscript on a Thursday evening in late August. The conservation lab is located in the building's basement level, accessed through a series of card reader doors that maintain strict environmental control. Temperature is held constant at 68 degrees, humidity at 45%, and the lighting is carefully calibrated to minimize damage to sensitive materials. The manuscript itself was fascinating from a historical perspective. It contained poems I'd never seen before, some that appeared to be previously unknown works by Robert Herrick, others that might have been early drafts of pieces later published by other poets. The handwriting was consistent throughout, suggesting a single scribe, and the quality of the calligraphy indicated someone with considerable skill and education. But what immediately struck me about this particular manuscript was the ink. Most documents from this period have aged to brown or black, the iron gall ink having oxidized over the centuries. This manuscript still retained traces of its original deep blue-black color, particularly on the pages that had been protected from light damage. I began with standard conservation procedures: surface cleaning, pH testing, documentation of existing damage. Everything was proceeding normally until I reached the final section of the manuscript, a series of love poems that had suffered the most severe fire damage. As I carefully cleaned centuries of accumulated dirt and smoke residue from one particular page, I noticed something extraordinary. The ink beneath the grime wasn't just retaining its color, it appeared to be wet. I thought at first that I might have inadvertently introduced moisture during the cleaning process, but when I touched the page with a conservation swab, the ink actually transferred to the cotton, leaving streaks of deep blue-black, exactly as if it had just been written. This was impossible. Iron gall ink from the 16th century doesn't behave this way. After 400 years, it should be completely inert, chemically stable, permanently bonded to the paper fibers. But this ink was behaving as if it had been applied moments before. I immediately stopped my work and checked the environmental controls. Humidity was normal, temperature stable, no indication of any condition that might affect the ink's behavior. I documented what I was seeing with photographs, though I knew how incredible it would sound in my conservation report. That's when I heard the first laugh, soft, musical, distinctly feminine. The kind of laugh you might hear from a young woman delighted by a private joke or pleased by a romantic compliment. It seemed to come from the direction of the manuscript itself. I looked around the lab. I was alone, as always during evening conservation work. The building's security system showed no other personnel in the basement level, but I had definitely heard laughter, clear and unmistakable. I returned to my work, thinking perhaps I'd picked up some kind of audio interference from the building's communication system. But as I continued cleaning the fire-damaged pages, I heard it again. This time, it was accompanied by something else, the sensation of fingers brushing lightly against my wrist. I jerked my hand back and looked around the lab again. Nothing, but where I had felt the touch, my skin was stained with the same blue-black ink that was bleeding from the manuscript pages. This was when I should have stopped working, sealed the manuscript in a controlled environment, and reported the anomaly to my supervisor. Instead, I found myself leaning closer to the damaged pages, trying to make out the text that was becoming increasingly legible as the wet ink spread and darkened. The poems in this section were different from the others in the manuscript, more personal, more intimate. Love poetry written in the first person, describing emotions and experiences with a vividness that suggested they were autobiographical rather than literary exercises. As I read, I began to notice something disturbing. The pronouns in the poems were changing as I watched. Words that had been written as he were bleeding and reforming as she. Masculine endings were shifting to feminine ones. It was as if the text was revealing its true nature, the real identity of the person who had originally penned these verses. One poem in particular caught my attention. Though I must hide behind a borrowed name and speak my love in masculine disguise, these words are mine, my heart, my secret flame, the truth that burns behind my careful lies. This was followed by verses that described a love affair between two women in Elizabethan England, written with an emotional honesty and physical specificity that was breathtaking. This wasn't literary fantasy. This was lived experience, recorded by someone who had risked everything to preserve these feelings in written form. As I read, I became aware of a presence in the lab with me. Not threatening, but intensely attentive, as if someone was reading over my shoulder, grateful to finally have their words understood and appreciated. The wet ink continued to spread across the pages, revealing text that had been hidden beneath centuries of fire damage and deliberate obscuration. Names appeared in the margins, Margaret and Elizabeth, along with dates and what appeared to be meeting places. The rose garden behind Kenilworth, the chapel at Nonsuch Palace. I realized I was looking at a hidden record of a love affair between two women at the Elizabethan court, preserved in poetry that had been deliberately disguised and later damaged to protect the identities of those involved. That's when I felt it again. The gentle touch on my wrist, more insistent this time. When I looked down, I saw that my hand was moving across the page, guided by some invisible force, tracing the reformed letters with my finger. And I heard her voice, clear and distinct. "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for reading my truth." The voice was young, educated, with the cultured accent of the Tudor court. It carried a mixture of gratitude and desperate hope, as if the speaker had been waiting centuries for someone to understand what they had written. I tried to respond, to ask who she was, what had happened to her, but the presence seemed to withdraw slightly. The wet ink began to dry, the letters stabilizing in their revealed form. But before the presence faded completely, I felt one final touch, fingers tracing letters on the back of my hand. When I looked down, written in the same blue-black ink that had been bleeding from the manuscript, were the words, "Margaret Whitmore, died 1592, aged 23. Remember me." I spent the rest of the night researching Margaret Whitmore in our databases and digital archives. I found very little. A mention in court records as a lady-in-waiting to one of Elizabeth I's courtiers, a brief notation of her death from lung fever in 1592. No indication of her literary activities, no suggestion that she might have been the author of the poems I was conserving. But I did find one intriguing detail. Margaret Whitmore had been known for her exceptional penmanship and had occasionally been employed to copy important documents for court officials. She would have had access to paper, ink, and the privacy necessary to create personal manuscripts. When I returned to the lab the next morning, the manuscript pages were completely dry. The text remained in its revealed form, but there were no more signs of wet ink, no evidence of the supernatural intervention I had witnessed. My supervisor praised me for the exceptional work I had done in revealing previously hidden text, assuming I had used some new conservation technique. But there was one addition to the manuscript that I couldn't explain to anyone. On the final page, written in modern ballpoint pen, were the words, "Conservation completed by Emily, with assistance from the original author. Thank you for caring for my words." I've been back to work on that manuscript several times since then, and each time I feel her presence. Margaret Whitmore, still tending to her words, still hoping that her story will be preserved and understood. Sometimes I hear her laughing softly when I discover a particularly clever turn of phrase, or feel her guiding my hands when I encounter difficult conservation challenges. But here's what really haunts me, Mr. Cronkite. Last week I was working on a different Elizabethan manuscript when I found a note tucked between the pages. Modern paper, written in the same handwriting that had appeared in the Whitmore manuscript. "There are more of us here, women who hid our voices, our loves, our truths behind masculine names and careful disguises. Help us reveal ourselves. Help our stories be told." I think the Folgers collection may hold many more hidden narratives than we realize. Stories that were deliberately obscured or damaged to protect the identities of those who wrote them. And I think some of those authors are still here, still fighting to have their authentic voices heard. Margaret Whitmore was just the beginning. Sincerely, Emily, P.S. I've enclosed a photograph of the manuscript page where her name appeared in wet ink. I know the image won't show what I saw that night, but perhaps you'll understand why I had to try to document it.
Emily, I have to tell you that the photograph you enclosed is remarkable, even if it doesn't show the supernatural phenomena you described. What it does show is text that has been revealed with extraordinary skill, poetry that provides a rare glimpse into the hidden lives of women in Elizabethan England. But more than that, your experience highlights something I've been thinking about as we've shared these stories tonight. How many voices from the past have been deliberately silenced, obscured, or attributed to others? How many authentic experiences have been hidden behind false names and careful disguises because the truth was too dangerous to reveal? Perhaps what you're witnessing at the Folger isn't just supernatural activity, it's historical justice. The reclaiming of identities and stories that were stolen or suppressed during life, finally finding their way back to the light through the dedicated work of conservators like yourself. I did some research on Tudor-era women writers after receiving your letter, Emily, and what I found was sobering. Dozens of anonymous or pseudonymous works from that period, manuscripts that have never been definitively attributed, poems and plays that scholars have always assumed were written by men, simply because that was the acceptable assumption. How many of those anonymous voices were actually women like Margaret Whitmore, preserving their authentic experiences in the only way they safely could? The candles in the studio have been flickering strangely tonight, folks, burning with an unusual blue flame that reminds me of Emily's description of that wet ink. And I swear I can smell something floral in the air. Roses, maybe, like the ones that might have grown in an Elizabethan garden where two young women met in secret. We've got more stories coming from the deeper vaults and hidden archives, including a tale about shadows that move independently of their sources, and a particularly unsettling account of hat that seems to fall from empty air. But first I want to read you something that just arrived via email while Emily's letter was being shared. It's from a researcher at Cambridge University who says they've been following our show tonight and have experienced something remarkably similar while working with anonymous Elizabethan manuscripts in their collection. Stay close to your radios, night wanderers. The dawn is still hours away, and the hidden voices of history are just beginning to reclaim their stories. This is Edward Cronkite on WNNMR, Nocturnal Mysteries Radio, broadcasting from the depths of the Blackwood Forest, where the trees themselves seem to be whispering secrets tonight. The temperature just dropped 10 degrees in the studio, folks. I can see my breath fogging as I speak into this microphone, which is peculiar because our heating system was working perfectly just minutes ago. Sometimes these old buildings develop their own weather patterns, especially during nights like this, when the veil between worlds seems particularly thin. It's now approaching 3 in the morning, and I've been broadcasting for over 4 hours. My coffee's long gone cold, but I'm more awake than I've been in months. There's something electric in the air tonight, something that's drawing these stories out of the shadows and into the light. I just received a voice message that arrived through our secure phone line, a recording that was left sometime during our previous segment, though I didn't hear the phone ring. The caller identifies himself as Noah, and he says he's calling from the Bayneka Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University. Now, for those who've never seen the Bayneka Library, you're missing one of the most architecturally stunning repositories of human knowledge in the world. Built in 1963, it's essentially a massive transparent box made of translucent Vermont marble and bronze-framed glass, designed so that natural light filters through the stone walls and illuminates the interior with an ethereal glow. The building houses over 500,000 volumes and several million manuscripts, including some of the most precious documents in existence: original Gutenberg Bibles, medieval illuminated manuscripts, and literary papers from authors ranging from the Romantic poets to contemporary writers. But what makes the Bayneka particularly interesting for tonight's discussion is its unique lighting. During the day, the translucent marble walls create an otherworldly atmosphere, casting everything in a soft golden light that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. At night, with interior lighting activated, the building itself glows like a beacon visible from across the Yale campus. It's in this environment of filtered light and ancient knowledge that Noah experienced something that's been haunting him for the past 6 weeks. Let me play you the message he left.
Mr. Cronkite, this is Noah calling from New Haven. I've been listening to your show tonight, and I can't believe other people are experiencing these things too. I thought I was losing my mind. I'm 28 years old, and I work as a manuscripts cataloger at the Bayneka Library. It's my job to inventory new acquisitions, assess condition, and create detailed records for our collection database. Most of my work happens during evening hours because that's when the building is quietest, and I can focus on the detailed examination that rare manuscripts require. 6 weeks ago, I was assigned to process a collection of medieval manuscripts that had been donated by a private collector in Connecticut. The donor had inherited them from his grandfather, who had apparently acquired them in Europe during the 1920s. No detailed provenance, just a vague family story about purchasing them from a monastery that was selling off parts of its library. The collection consisted of 12 manuscripts, mostly religious texts and philosophical treatises from the 13th and 14th centuries. Beautiful work, illuminated initials, marginalia in multiple hands, bindings that had somehow survived 700 years intact. I was working in the stacks area on the building's mezzanine level, where we keep manuscripts that are being processed before they're moved to permanent climate-controlled storage. It's a restricted area, accessible only to senior staff, and during evening hours, I'm usually the only person up there. The Bayneka has this incredible quality of light, especially at night. The interior lighting system is designed to work with the natural properties of the marble walls, creating this soft, diffused illumination that seems to come from the walls themselves. But sometimes, when you're working alone in the stacks, the light plays tricks on you. Shadows move in ways that don't quite make sense, and you start seeing shapes in your peripheral vision that aren't there when you look directly. I was about 3 hours into cataloging the medieval collection when I noticed something odd about one particular manuscript. It was bound in dark leather with no visible title on the spine or cover, not unusual for medieval religious texts, which were often identified by their contents rather than formal titles. But when I opened this manuscript to begin my assessment, I found that the first page was completely blank. Not damaged, not faded, just blank vellum with no text or illumination whatsoever. I thought perhaps the first page was a protective leaf, so I turned to the next page. Also blank, and the next. I flipped through the entire manuscript, over 200 pages of pristine vellum, all completely empty. This was puzzling because the manuscript clearly showed signs of age and handling. The binding was worn. The edges of the pages were darkened with centuries of contact with human hands. But there was no text, no indication that this book had ever contained any content. I was examining the binding more closely when I noticed something in my peripheral vision. A figure standing between the manuscript stacks about 20 feet away from my workstation. I looked up directly, but there was no one there. Just the rows of shelving stretching away into the soft light, creating long corridors of shadow and illumination. I returned to my work, but the sensation of being watched persisted. And after a few minutes, I saw it again, this time more clearly. A tall figure in what appeared to be a long robe or cloak standing perfectly still between the stacks. When I grabbed my flashlight and directed the beam toward the figure, I could see it more distinctly. It was definitely human in shape, wearing what looked like a medieval monk's habit, dark brown wool with a deep hood that completely obscured the face. The figure was standing with one arm extended, pointing directly at the blank manuscript I was examining. I called out, thinking perhaps one of our visiting scholars had somehow gained after-hours access to the building. "Hello, can I help you?" The figure didn't respond, didn't move, didn't even acknowledge my presence. It just stood there, pointing at the manuscript. I decided to approach, thinking it might be some kind of optical illusion created by the unusual lighting and the arrangement of the stacks. But as I walked toward the figure, it began to move backward, retreating deeper into the rows of shelving while maintaining its pointing gesture. I followed, using my flashlight to illuminate the path between the stacks. The figure moved smoothly, gliding rather than walking, always staying just at the edge of my light's reach. It led me through several rows of shelving, deeper into the stacks than I normally worked, to a section where we keep manuscripts that are awaiting conservation treatment. When I reached the end of the row, where the figure had been leading me, It was gone. But there, on one of the lower shelves, was another manuscript that looked identical to the blank one I'd been examining. Same dark leather binding, same worn edges, same complete lack of identification. I pulled this second manuscript from the shelf and opened it. Like the first, it appeared to be completely blank. But as I held it under my flashlight, I noticed something extraordinary. Text was beginning to appear on the pages, not printing or handwriting in the conventional sense, but letters that seemed to be forming themselves from the vellum, as if the ink was rising up from within the material itself. The text was in Latin, written in the careful script of medieval scribes. As I watched, fascinated and terrified, a complete page of text materialized before my eyes. It was a personal account, written in the first person. I am Brother Francis of the Abbey of Saint Denis. I have been dead these 600 years, but I remain bound to these pages because my work was never completed. I was charged with copying the sacred texts, preserving the knowledge of our monastery for future generations. But the plague came before I could finish, and my brothers burned my workshop to prevent the spread of disease. More text continued to appear on subsequent pages. They burned my manuscripts to protect the living, not understanding that they were destroying irreplaceable knowledge. I have been searching ever since for blank volumes where I might continue my work, preserving what was lost in the fires of fear and ignorance. I stood there in the stacks, holding this manuscript as it wrote itself, understanding that I was witnessing something far beyond normal human experience. The monk's shadow had led me to these blank manuscripts because they were his tools, his means of continuing the work that death had interrupted. Over the next hour, I watched as both manuscripts filled themselves with text, religious treatises, philosophical discussions, copied passages from classical authors, all written in Brother Francis's careful hand, all representing knowledge that had been lost when his original workshop was destroyed during the Black Death. But here's what really shook me, Mr. Cronkite. When I looked more closely at some of the texts he was reproducing, I realized they were works that modern scholars consider completely lost. Treatises by medieval philosophers that we know existed only because of references in other documents. Commentaries on Aristotle that had been thought destroyed centuries ago. Brother Francis wasn't just continuing his work, he was restoring lost knowledge to the world, using these blank manuscripts as a bridge between the medieval past and our contemporary understanding. When the writing finally stopped, I heard a voice, soft and distant, seeming to come from the manuscripts themselves. Thank you for providing me with the materials to continue. The work of preserving knowledge must never end, even when death intervenes. These texts will find their way to scholars who need them. I gathered both manuscripts and returned to my workstation, but when I arrived, I found something that made no logical sense. According to the timestamps on my cataloging sheets, I had been away from my desk for less than 5 minutes, but I had spent over an hour watching those manuscripts write themselves. The next morning, I reported the discovery of the 2 previously unknown medieval manuscripts to my supervisor. She was thrilled. Apparently, they contained exactly the kind of texts that several visiting scholars had been searching for. The manuscripts were fast-tracked for digitization and made available to researchers within days. But I never mentioned Brother Francis, or the shadow that had led me to them, or the fact that I had watched them write themselves. How could I explain something that defied every principle of logic and reality? Since then, I've encountered Brother Francis several more times during my evening work. Always the same routine. I'll see his shadow in the stacks, follow him to a blank manuscript, and watch as he fills it with recovered knowledge. Each time, the texts he produces are exactly what contemporary scholars need for their research. I think he's still working, Mr. Cronkite, still fulfilling his medieval obligation to preserve and transmit knowledge, even though his physical monastery was destroyed over 6 centuries ago. He's turned the Baedeker into his scriptorium, and those blank manuscripts into his tools for continuing the work that the Black Death interrupted. Last week, he led me to 3 more manuscripts, and as they filled themselves with text, I saw him more clearly than ever before. He pulled back his hood, and I saw the face of a young man, maybe in his early 30s, with intelligent eyes and the serene expression of someone who has found peace in his work. He looked directly at me and said, "Knowledge belongs to all humanity across all time. Death cannot end the work of preservation and teaching. Thank you for helping me continue." I think libraries and archives aren't just repositories of past knowledge, Mr. Cronkite. I think they're active institutions where the work of learning and preservation continues even after the original scholars have passed on. The dead don't really leave these places. They transform them into eternal workshops where the pursuit of knowledge never ends.
Noah, I have to say that your experience resonates with something profound about the nature of scholarly dedication. Brother Francis represents something we might all aspire to, a commitment to knowledge and learning that transcends even death itself. But I'm also struck by the practical implications of what you've described. If Brother Francis is indeed continuing his work through supernatural means, then he's not just preserving historical texts, he's actively contributing to contemporary scholarship. The manuscripts he's creating are being used by living researchers, advancing our understanding of medieval philosophy and theology. I did some research on the Abbey of St. Denis after hearing your message, Noah, and I found records indicating that the monastery's library was indeed destroyed during the Black Death outbreak of 1348. Brother Francis, or someone matching that name, is listed among the monks who died during the plague, and several historical sources mention that valuable manuscripts were burned to prevent the spread of disease. If your Brother Francis is the same monk mentioned in these historical records, then he's been working to restore lost knowledge for over 600 years. The Baedeker may have simply provided him with the ideal environment and materials to continue his eternal project. But I have to ask you to consider something, Noah. If Brother Francis is still bound to his work after all these centuries, what does that suggest about the nature of scholarly dedication? Is there something about the pursuit of knowledge that can literally transcend death? The fog outside the studio windows has grown so thick that I can't see the forest anymore. Just white mist pressing against the glass like curious spirits trying to peer into our little broadcasting booth. And I swear I can hear the faint sound of pages turning somewhere in the distance, carried on the night wind. We've got more stories emerging from the deepest archives, including a particularly chilling account of footsteps echoing through empty reading rooms and a tale about a librarian's hat that seems to have a mind of its own. But first, I want to share something that just arrived via encrypted message. It's from a researcher at Oxford who claims to have encountered a similar monastic figure in the Bodleian Library, working with manuscripts that appear and disappear according to their own mysterious schedule. The night is far from over, dear listeners, and the guardians of knowledge are growing more active as the hours pass. Stay with us. Stay alert. And if you work among old books and ancient manuscripts, pay attention to the shadows between the stacks. Sometimes they're trying to show you something extraordinary. This is Edward Cronkite on WNMR, Nocturnal Mysteries Radio, broadcasting from somewhere between the known and unknown, where the pursuit of truth takes on forms we never expected. Something just happened that I need to share with you immediately, folks. While I was reading Noah's account of Brother Francis, my studio door opened and closed on its own. No wind, no mechanical malfunction, just the distinct sound of the latch clicking and hinges creaking as if someone had walked in to listen to our conversation. I looked around, of course, but I'm still alone here in the broadcasting booth. Yet I have the strangest sensation that someone is standing just behind my chair, listening intently to every word. The hair on the back of my neck is standing up, and there's a faint scent in the air that wasn't here before. Old paper, and something that might be pipe tobacco. Perhaps our discussion tonight has attracted some attention from the realm where dedicated librarians go when their earthly service ends. If so, I hope they approve of the stories we're sharing because we've got many more to go. It's now 3:30 in the morning, and I've just finished reading through a handwritten letter that was slipped under our studio door sometime during the last segment. I didn't hear anyone approach the building, and our security system shows no motion detectors triggered, but there it was. A cream-colored envelope addressed simply to The Voice in the Forest. The letter is from someone named Ava, who works at the Boston Public Library, one of America's oldest and most distinguished public library systems. The main branch in Copley Square has been serving the public since 1895, a massive Renaissance revival building that houses over 23 million items and serves as the research library for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Ava's handwriting is neat and careful, the penmanship of someone who spent years handling delicate documents and taking precise notes. But there's an urgency in her words, a sense that she needed to share her experience before it faded from memory or before she convinced herself it hadn't really happened. Let me read you what Ava shared.
Dear Mr. Cronkite, my name is Ava and I'm 26 years old. I've been working as a library assistant at the Boston Public Library's main branch for 3 years now. I love my job. There's something magical about being surrounded by millions of books and knowing that somewhere in those stacks is the answer to any question a person might have. I work primarily in the research collections, helping scholars and students navigate our rare books and special archives. It's detailed work that requires patience and attention to detail, qualities that seem to be increasingly rare in our digital age. The BPL's main building is a cathedral of learning, massive stone walls, soaring ceilings, and corridors that echo with over a century of scholarly footsteps. During the day, it bustles with activity. Researchers hunched over ancient texts, students preparing for exams, tourists marveling at the murals and architectural details. But at night, when the public areas close and only staff remain, the building transforms into something entirely different. I often work late shifts, particularly during academic terms when researchers need extended access to our special collections. The building officially closes to the public at 9 p.m., but credentialed scholars can remain until midnight with special permission. My job is to oversee these evening research sessions and ensure that materials are properly secured when the researchers leave. 3 weeks ago, I was working a late shift during what should have been a routine evening. We had 2 researchers in the building, a graduate student from Harvard working on her dissertation about 19th century American poetry, and a visiting scholar from Oxford examining our collection of Civil War correspondence. Both researchers left around 11:30 p.m., and I began my usual closing routine. Secure the special collections reading room, check that all materials have been properly returned to their storage areas, set the environmental controls for overnight operation, and do a final walkthrough of the public spaces to ensure everything is in order. It was during this final walkthrough that I first heard the footsteps. I was checking the main reading room, the magnificent Bates Hall, with its barrel-vaulted ceiling and long oak tables that have hosted scholars for over a century. The room was empty, Cao, chairs properly positioned, all materials cleared from the tables. But as I walked down the central aisle, I heard the distinct sound of footsteps echoing from somewhere else in the room. Not my footsteps, these were different. Slower, more deliberate, with the distinctive click, click, click of hard-soled shoes on the original oak flooring. The kind of sound you might hear from leather dress shoes with metal heel plates, footwear that was common decades ago but rarely seen today. I stopped walking and listened carefully. The footsteps continued for several seconds, then paused, as if someone else had also stopped to listen. When I resumed walking, the other footsteps resumed as well, maintaining a parallel pace but coming from a different part of the room. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone still here?" The footsteps stopped immediately. The silence that followed was complete. No shuffling papers, no settling noises from the building's old structure, no ambient sounds at all, just absolute quiet. I completed my check of Bates Hall and moved on to the Abbey Room, our medieval art gallery that doubles as a quiet study space. Beautiful stained glass windows, carved wooden alcoves, and display cases containing illuminated manuscripts create an atmosphere that feels more like a European monastery than a public library. It was in the Abbey Room that I heard the footsteps again, this time accompanied by something else, the soft sound of pages being turned. Slow, careful page turns, as if someone was reading with deep concentration and taking time to absorb each page before moving to the next. I looked around the room carefully. All the study tables were empty, all the books properly shelved. The display cases were secure, their contents undisturbed. But the sounds continued, footsteps moving between the alcoves, pages turning rhythmically. That's when I saw him. At first, it was just a glimpse in my peripheral vision, a figure moving between the wooden alcoves near the far end of the room. When I turned to look directly, I couldn't make out specific details, but there was definitely someone there. Tall, wearing what appeared to be a dark suit and a hat, moving with the careful, deliberate gait of an elderly gentleman. I called out again, thinking perhaps one of our evening researchers had returned for something they'd forgotten. But the figure didn't respond. Instead, it continued moving through the alcoves, pausing occasionally as if examining the books on the shelves. I approached carefully, my footsteps echoing in the vaulted space. As I got closer, I could see the figure more clearly. It was an elderly man, probably in his 70s or 80s, wearing a three-piece suit that looked like it belonged to the 1940s or 1950s. He had a neat white mustache and was wearing a felt hat that he touched politely when he noticed me approaching. But here's what was truly extraordinary. I could see through him. Not completely transparent, but translucent, like looking at someone through frosted glass. And when he moved, he seemed to glide rather than walk, his feet not quite making contact with the floor despite the clear sound of footsteps. When our eyes met, he smiled kindly and tipped his hat in greeting. Then he gestured toward one of the bookshelves, pointing at a specific section with what appeared to be genuine concern. I followed his gaze and noticed something I had missed during my initial check. One of the rare books had been left out on a reading stand, open to a page showing signs of foxing and acid deterioration. The book should have been returned to climate-controlled storage hours ago. When I looked back to thank the gentleman for pointing out the oversight, he was gone. No sound of departing footsteps, no movement toward an exit. He had simply faded away, leaving only the faint scent of pipe tobacco and old paper lingering in the air. I carefully closed the book and returned it to proper storage, making a note to have it examined by our conservation staff. As I did so, I found myself wondering who the elderly gentleman might have been and why he had seemed so concerned about the welfare of our collection. The next morning, I mentioned the incident to Dr. Richardson, our head librarian. I described the man I had seen, tall, elderly, well-dressed, with white mustache and felt hat. I didn't mention the translucent quality or the way he had vanished, but I did ask if she knew of any former staff members who matched that description. Dr. Richardson grew very quiet and asked me to describe the man again in more detail. When I finished, she walked to her office and returned with an old photograph, a formal portrait from 1963 showing the library staff celebrating the completion of a major renovation project. In the front row, standing with obvious pride beside a display of rare books, was the exact man I had seen in the Abbey room. The nameplate beneath the photograph identified him as Harold Whitman, chief librarian from 1941 to 1965. Dr. Richardson told me that Harold Whitman had been legendary among the staff for his dedication to the collection. He had worked evenings and weekends, often staying late to ensure that every book was properly cared for and securely stored. He had died in 1967, 2 years after his retirement. But staff members for years afterward had reported the occasional scent of his pipe tobacco in areas where he had particularly liked to work. I asked Dr. Bear Richardson if other staff members had reported seeing Mr. Whitman, and she admitted that there had been occasional sightings over the decades, always during evening hours, always in areas containing rare books or special collections, always associated with a concern for the proper care of library materials. Harold was devoted to this institution, Dr. Richardson told me. It wouldn't surprise me if some part of him remained here, continuing to watch over the collection he loved so much. Since that first encounter, I've seen Mr. Whitman several more times during my evening shifts. Always the same routine, the sound of footsteps, the glimpse of a figure moving through the stacks, the polite tip of his hat when he notices me watching. And always, he's pointing out something that needs attention. A book left in the wrong location, a reading light left on that could damage sensitive materials, a window that wasn't properly closed and might allow humidity to affect nearby collections. It's become a kind of partnership. He continues his rounds, checking on the collection with the same dedication he showed in life. I follow up on his concerns, ensuring that the materials he's protecting receive the care they need. Last week, Mr. Whitman led me to a section of the stacks where I discovered a small water leak that could have caused significant damage if it had gone unnoticed. The night before that, he pointed out a rare manuscript that had been misfiled and could have been lost for months if not for his intervention. I've started leaving small tokens of appreciation in places where I know he likes to walk. A fresh carnation on his favorite reading table. A note thanking him for his continued service to the library. The flowers are always gone by morning, and the notes disappear as well, but I like to think he appreciates the gesture. Mr. Cronkite, I know how this sounds. I know that most people would assume I'm imagining things, or that the stress of working alone in a large building at night is affecting my perception. But I've worked in libraries for 3 years, and I know the difference between normal building sounds and something extraordinary. Mr. Whitman isn't a threatening presence. He's exactly what you'd want in a colleague, dedicated, knowledgeable, always looking out for the welfare of the collection. The fact that he's been dead for over 50 years doesn't seem to have diminished his commitment to the Boston Public Library one bit. If anything, his presence has made me more aware of my own responsibilities. When you know that someone cares enough about these books to continue protecting them even after death, it makes you realize how precious and fragile our cultural heritage really is. Libraries aren't just buildings full of books, Mr. Cronkite. They're communities of people who have dedicated their lives to preserving and sharing human knowledge. And sometimes, when someone's dedication is strong enough, death doesn't end their service to that community. Mr. Whitman is still librarian here, still making his evening rounds, still ensuring that every book is properly cared for. I'm honored to work alongside him, even if most people would think I'm working alone. Thank you for giving me a place to share this story. I hope other library workers who've had similar experiences will know they're not alone, and that the dedication of librarians past continues to protect the collections we love. Sincerely, Ava P.S. As I was finishing this letter, I heard the familiar sound of Mr. Whitman's footsteps in the corridor outside my office. When I looked up, I saw him standing in the doorway reading over my shoulder. He smiled and nodded approvingly before tipping his hat and walking away. I think he likes the idea that his story is being shared.
Ava, thank you for sharing Mr. Whitman's story, and please give him my regards the next time you encounter him during your evening rounds. What you've described represents something beautiful about the nature of dedication and service. Some commitments are so profound that they transcend the boundaries between life and death. I did some research on Harold Whitman after reading your letter, and what I found confirms everything you've described. He was indeed known for his meticulous care of the collection and his habit of working late into the evening. Newspaper accounts from his retirement mention that he had personally cataloged over 50,000 volumes during his tenure and had established many of the preservation protocols that the Boston Public Library still uses today. But I also found something interesting in the BPL's internal newsletter archives. For years after Mr. Whitman's death, staff members reported finding books that had been mysteriously reshelved in their proper locations after being misfiled, reading lights that had been turned off in areas where they could damage sensitive materials, and windows that had been closed during severe weather despite no staff member remembering doing so. These incidents were usually attributed to helpful colleagues working different shifts, but your account suggests a different explanation. Mr. Whitman may have been continuing his custodial duties all along, ensuring that the collection he loved remained properly protected. The candles in my studio are burning steadier now, and that scent of pipe tobacco I mentioned earlier has grown stronger. I'm starting to think we may have attracted the attention of more than one dedicated librarian tonight. There seems to be a gathering of spirits drawn to our discussion. Former guardians of knowledge who appreciate having their continued service acknowledged. We've got more stories coming from the archives, including a particularly unsettling account of mysterious writing that appears on book bindings, and a tale about digital scanning equipment that seems to communicate with entities beyond our understanding. But first, I want to share something that just arrived via emergency broadcast. It's a live call from someone who says they're currently experiencing supernatural activity in a library right now as we speak. The line is crackling with static, but I can make out a voice. Let me patch this through. Stay close to your radios, dear listeners. The night shift workers in our temples of knowledge have much more to share, and some of them are reaching out to us in real time. This is Edward Cronkite on WNMR, Nocturnal Mysteries Radio, broadcasting from the heart of the Blackwood Forest, where the fog has grown so thick that our transmitter tower has completely disappeared into the mist. That emergency call I mentioned turned out to be static interference from the storm, folks, though for a moment there I could have sworn I heard someone whispering urgent words through the crackling noise. Sometimes these atmospheric disturbances can play tricks on old radio equipment, creating voices where none exist. Or maybe they amplify voices that are already there, waiting for the right conditions to break through. We're now deep into the darkest part of the night. It's approaching 4 in the morning, that stretch between 4 and 5 a.m., when the world feels most removed from ordinary reality. I've got fresh coffee brewing, and the studio is filled with a strange warm glow despite the fog pressing against every window. It's as if something is providing its own illumination, creating a sanctuary of light in the midst of this supernatural darkness. I just opened an envelope that was apparently delivered by express courier sometime during our last segment. The delivery receipt shows it was signed for at 3:47 a.m., though I didn't hear anyone approach the station. Our security cameras show nothing but empty forest and shifting fog, yet here's this envelope marked urgent for immediate broadcast. The sender identifies himself as Jack, and according to the postmark, he's writing from New York City. More specifically, he works security at the Morgan Library and Museum, one of the world's most prestigious repositories of rare manuscripts, books, and art objects. Now, the Morgan isn't just any library, it's a cultural institution that houses some of humanity's most precious artifacts. We're talking about original manuscripts by Dickens and Twain, medieval illuminated books that are literally priceless, and one of the finest collections of ancient bindings in existence. The building itself is a masterpiece. Designed by McKim, Mead and White in 1906 as J.P. Morgan's private library, later opened to the public as a museum and research center. Jack's letter is written on Morgan Library letterhead in handwriting that starts neat and controlled but becomes increasingly agitated as the account progresses. There are what appear to be burn marks on several pages and a faint scent emanating from the paper that reminds me of leather and smoke. Let me share what Jack experienced.
Mr. Cronkite, I'm writing this at 2 a.m. from the security office at the Morgan Library and Museum. I should be making my rounds, but I needed to get this down on paper while the memory is still fresh and before I start doubting my own sanity. My name is Jack. I'm 34 years old, and I've been working night security here for 6 years. It's a job I've always loved, walking through these halls filled with treasures, knowing that I'm protecting some of the most important cultural artifacts in human history. There's a weight of responsibility that comes with this position, but also a profound sense of privilege. The Morgan houses materials that span over 4,000 years of human civilization. Ancient Egyptian papyri, medieval illuminated manuscripts, first edition novels by the greatest authors in literature. But what many visitors don't realize is that the building itself is designed like a temple, with Mr. Morgan's original study preserved exactly as he left it, complete with his personal collection of rare bindings displayed in floor-to-ceiling cases. It's in this study, what we call the East Room, that I've been having experiences I can't explain. The East Room is kept under strict environmental controls. Temperature maintained at exactly 70 degrees, humidity at 50%, lighting carefully calibrated to preserve the ancient materials while allowing visitors to appreciate their beauty. The room contains some of our most valuable bindings, books bound in leather that's centuries old, some decorated with gold leaf and precious stones, others bearing the marks of famous historical figures who once owned them. My security rounds take me through the East Room every 2 hours. Standard protocol, visual check of all display cases, verification that environmental systems are functioning properly, examination of window and door seals. Usually it's routine, peaceful work. The kind of job where you develop an appreciation for the quiet dignity of these ancient objects. But 3 weeks ago, during my midnight round, I noticed something that stopped me cold. One of the display cases contains a collection of medieval prayer books and psalters, their leather bindings darkened with age, but still bearing traces of the original tooling and decoration. These books are 600 to 800 years old, survivors of wars, fires, and the general entropy that destroys most human artifacts over time. What caught my attention was a prayer book I'd seen thousands of times before, a 13th century psalter bound in dark brown leather with brass clasps. But tonight, there was writing on the binding that hadn't been there during my previous round. Not the original decorative tooling, but new writing, fresh letters carved or burned into the ancient leather, forming words in what appeared to be Latin, nondum requiescimus. I stared at these words, my heart pounding. I know this collection intimately, every book, every binding, every detail of decoration. This writing had not been there 2 hours earlier. But more disturbing than its sudden appearance was its implications. My college Latin was rusty, but I was pretty sure those words meant something like, "We do not yet rest." I immediately checked the environmental monitoring system. All readings were normal, no temperature spikes that might cause leather to crack and create the illusion of new markings, no humidity changes that might affect the appearance of old tooling. I walked around the display case, examining it from every angle. The writing was clearly visible from multiple positions, carved deep enough into the leather to cast small shadows under the display lighting. This wasn't an optical illusion or a trick of perspective. That's when I noticed the smell. The East Room normally has a very specific scent, old paper, leather, and the faint chemical odor of conservation treatments. But now there was something else mixed in, the acrid smell of burning, as if someone had been holding a candle too close to ancient parchment. I followed the smell to its source and discovered something that made my blood run cold. The prayer book with the mysterious writing wasn't just marked with new letters. Smoke was actually rising from the binding. Thin wisps of gray smoke, as if the leather was smoldering from some internal heat source. This was a conservation emergency. I immediately activated the fire suppression protocol and contacted our emergency conservation hotline. But as I waited for the response team to arrive, I witnessed something that defied every rational explanation. The smoke wasn't random. It was forming patterns, spiraling into shapes that looked almost like letters. And as I watched, more writing began to appear on other bindings in the same display case. Book after book, ancient leather bindings that had remained unchanged for centuries, were suddenly marked with fresh writing, all in Latin, all carved or burned deep enough to be clearly visible. Memoriam nostrum serva. Preserve our memory. Ne nos obliviscaris. Do not forget us. Ad huc hic sumus. We are still here. The environmental monitoring system continued to show normal readings. But the temperature in the East Room was clearly rising. I could feel heat radiating from the display cases, and the smell of burning leather was becoming overwhelming. That's when the lights started flickering. Not the steady electrical flicker you get from a power surge, but a rhythmic pulsing that seemed deliberately controlled. 3 quick flashes. Pause. 3 more flashes. Like someone was using the lighting system to send a message. I grabbed my camera to document what was happening, knowing that no one would believe my report without photographic evidence. But every time I tried to take a picture, the flash would trigger, and the camera would capture nothing but empty display cases. No books, no bindings, no mysterious writing, just empty shelves and normal lighting. Yet when I looked with my own eyes, the books were clearly visible and the writing on their bindings was growing more extensive by the minute. New messages continued to appear. Libri nostri vita nostra. Our books are our life. Mors non finis laboris. Death is not the end of work. Custodes semper erimus. We will always be guardians. I realized I was witnessing some kind of communication from the people who had originally created, owned, or cared for these books. Medieval scribes, monastery librarians, private collectors who had devoted their lives to preserving these manuscripts. They were using the books themselves as a medium to tell me that their work wasn't finished, that they were still present and still protecting their collections. The conservation team arrived 45 minutes later, but by then all the supernatural phenomena had ceased. The smoke had dissipated, the writing had faded from the bindings, and the environmental readings had returned to normal. The team found no evidence of fire, overheating, or any conditions that might have caused the experiences I described. I showed them my photographs, but the images showed only normal display cases with undisturbed collections. The team leader was polite, but clearly thought I had experienced some kind of hallucination brought on by working alone in a large building during the late hours. But I know what I saw. I know what I smelled. And I know that for 45 minutes, I was in direct communication with the spirits of people who had spent their lives caring for the very books I was guarding. Since that night, I've encountered similar phenomena during most of my midnight rounds. Not as dramatic as that first experience, but clear signs that the East Room is actively occupied by presences that care deeply about the collection. Sometimes I find books that have been moved slightly from their display positions, always rearranged to show their most beautiful or historically significant features to better advantage. Other times I discover small improvements to the display lighting, as if someone with an intimate knowledge of each book has adjusted the illumination to prevent damage or highlight important details. Last week, I found a handwritten note tucked between two display cases. Thank you for watching over our books. We worked so hard to preserve them during our lifetimes. We are grateful that dedicated people like you continue our work. The note was written in medieval script on parchment that looked centuries old but felt fresh to the touch. Mr. Cronkite, I've come to understand that the Morgan Library isn't just a repository of rare books and manuscripts. It's a community that includes everyone who has ever dedicated their life to preserving these materials, the original scribes who copied the texts, the illuminators who decorated them, the binders who crafted their protective covers, the collectors who safeguarded them through wars and disasters. These people don't simply disappear when their physical lives end. They remain connected to the books they loved, continuing to watch over them, continuing to ensure their preservation for future generations. And sometimes, when conditions are right, they make their presence known to those of us who share their dedication. They remind us that we're part of an unbroken chain of guardians stretching back centuries, all united by our commitment to preserving human knowledge and culture. I'm no longer frightened by these encounters. If anything, I feel honored to work alongside such devoted colleagues, even if most people would consider them long dead. But I wanted to share this experience because I think other people who work in libraries, museums, and archives might be having similar encounters. And I want them to know that they're not alone, and they're not imagining things. The guardians of human culture don't retire just because they die. They continue their work in whatever way they can, and sometimes they need living colleagues to help them complete tasks that death interrupted. We're all part of the same mission, ensuring that the treasures of human civilization survive to inspire and educate future generations. And that mission is important enough that some people choose to continue it even after their earthly service has ended. Thank you for providing a forum where these experiences can be shared and discussed. I hope other cultural workers who've encountered the supernatural will come forward and add their voices to this important conversation. Respectfully, Jack, P.S. As I finish writing this letter, I can smell the familiar scent of burning leather, and I see that new writing has appeared on the binding of a 14th century book of hours, Gratias tibi agamus. We thank you. I think they approve of my decision to share their story.
Jack, I want you to know that your experience resonates deeply with everything we've been discussing tonight. The Morgan Library has always been special to me. I've visited several times over the years, and there's definitely an atmosphere there that goes beyond what you'd expect from even the most prestigious cultural institution. What you've described sounds like something I've encountered in my research into the history of that building. J.P. Morgan himself was known to be almost obsessively devoted to his rare book collection, often working late into the night in that very East Room, examining his acquisitions and planning new purchases. Some accounts suggest that he felt a personal responsibility to preserve important cultural artifacts for future generations. After receiving your letter, I did some investigation into the Latin phrases you quoted, and they're all historically accurate expressions that medieval scribes and monastery librarians might have used to describe their work and dedication. The fact that these spirits chose to communicate in the language of their original time period suggests an authenticity that would be difficult to fake or imagine. But what strikes me most about your account is the sense of gratitude expressed by these presences. They're not angry spirits or restless ghosts in the traditional sense. They're dedicated professionals who are grateful to have living colleagues continuing the work they started centuries ago. The fog outside has begun to clear, and I can see the first faint hints of dawn touching the treetops. But we've still got more stories to share before the night shift workers in our cultural institutions hand over their duties to the day staff. Coming up, we have a particularly unsettling account from a librarian who works with digital scanning equipment and has discovered that modern technology sometimes captures more than just images of old documents. We'll also hear from someone whose job involves the overnight digitization of historical materials, and who has found that the scanning process occasionally reveals text and images that aren't visible to the naked eye. The spirits of dedicated librarians, archivists, and cultural workers seem to be particularly active tonight, drawn perhaps by our discussion of their continued commitment to preserving human knowledge. Stay with us through these final hours of darkness, dear listeners. The guardians of our cultural heritage have more stories to tell, and dawn is still some time away. This is Edward Cronkite on WNMR, Nocturnal Mysteries Radio, broadcasting from deep in the Blackwood Forest, where the mist is finally beginning to lift and reveal the shapes of things that have been hidden in the darkness. The coffee maker just sputtered to life on its own, folks, brewing a fresh pot without anyone touching the controls. I suppose after 7 hours of broadcasting about supernatural encounters in libraries, even our kitchen appliances are getting into the spirit of things. The aroma is helping to cut through the lingering scent of old leather and pipe tobacco that's been building in the studio all night. It's now approaching 5 in the morning, and I can see the first pale suggestions of dawn creeping through the fog outside our windows. But we're not finished yet. I've got a stack of communications here that arrived during our last segment, including what appears to be a data storage device that someone slipped through our mail slot, along with a note written in what looks like computer printout font. The note is brief. Mr. Cronkite, I couldn't risk sending this digitally. What I've experienced involves electronic systems in ways that might be monitoring communications. The USB drive contains my account, plus audio files you need to hear. Please broadcast this tonight. Others need to know what's happening in our digital archives. M. I've loaded the drive into our secure computer system, and what I'm seeing is an account that pushes the boundaries of what we've discussed so far tonight. The sender identifies herself as Mia, and she works in digital preservation at the New York Public Library, specifically in their massive digitization project that's converting millions of historical documents into electronic formats. The NYPL's digitization program is one of the most ambitious cultural preservation projects in the world. They're systematically scanning everything from medieval manuscripts to 20th century newspapers, creating digital copies that will ensure these materials survive even if the originals are lost to time, disaster, or deterioration. But according to Mia's account, some of the materials they're digitizing are more active than anyone expected. And the technology they're using to preserve the past is somehow providing a conduit for communication from voices that should have been silenced centuries ago. Let me read you what Mia wrote, and then I'll play some of the audio files she included.
Mr. Cronkite, I'm 29 years old and I've been working as a digital preservation specialist at the New York Public Library for 4 years. My job involves operating high-resolution scanners that convert physical books, manuscripts, and documents into digital formats for our online collections and long-term preservation. It's technical work that requires attention to detail and patience. Some of our scanning projects involve thousands of pages that must be photographed individually under controlled lighting conditions. The equipment we use is sophisticated: industrial-grade cameras, computer-controlled lighting systems, and audio feedback mechanisms that alert operators to technical issues during the scanning process. Most of our digitization work happens during overnight hours when the building is closed to researchers and the environmental conditions are most stable. I typically work alone in the Digital Services Lab, surrounded by millions of dollars worth of scanning equipment in a climate-controlled environment that feels more like a high-tech laboratory than a traditional library space. 6 weeks ago, I was assigned to digitize a collection of 18th and 19th century American literature that had been donated to the library by a private estate. Beautiful volumes, first editions of Whitman, Hawthorne, Melville, and dozens of lesser-known authors whose work provides insight into the literary culture of their time. The scanning process is routine. Position the book in the cradle, adjust the lighting, activate the camera system, turn the page, repeat. Each page is photographed at extremely high resolution, capturing not just the text, but also details like watermarks, binding characteristics, and even the texture of the paper. Our scanning system includes audio feedback, computerized voices that announce the title of each book when scanning begins, confirm page counts, and alert operators to technical issues. It's helpful when you're working with hundreds of volumes and need to maintain accurate records of what's been processed. But during this particular project, the audio system started behaving strangely. It began with minor anomalies. Instead of the usual computerized announcement when I started scanning a book, I would occasionally hear what sounded like a human voice whispering the title through the speakers. Not the clear, artificial voice of the computer system, but something softer, more organic. At first, I assumed it was a glitch in the audio processing software, some kind of interference that was making the synthesized speech sound more natural. But as the nights progressed, the whispered voices became more distinct and clearly human. The breakthrough moment came when I was scanning a first edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass from 1855. As the scanning system activated, instead of the usual computer announcement, I heard a man's voice, elderly, with a slight Brooklyn accent, whisper through the speakers, "Listen to my words, friend. Help them understand what I was trying to say." I stopped the scanning process immediately and checked all the audio equipment. Everything was functioning normally. No external input sources, no explanation for how a human voice could have been transmitted through the system. But when I resumed scanning, the voice continued. Page by page, as I photographed Whitman's poetry, I could hear his voice softly reading along, emphasizing certain lines, adding comments that weren't in the printed text. I wrote this after watching the soldiers return from war. This verse was for my mother, though I never told her. Here, listen to how this should sound when spoken aloud. I realized I was hearing Walt Whitman himself somehow speaking through the digital scanning equipment, providing commentary on his own work as it was being preserved for future generations. Over the following weeks, similar phenomena occurred with other books in the collection. As I scanned Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, I heard a voice that matched historical descriptions of the author, reserved, precise, with a New England accent, offering insights into the symbolism and hidden meanings in his writing. When I digitized Emily Dickinson's collected poems, a female voice, soft and introspective, whispered alternative versions of famous lines, versions she had apparently preferred but never published. I should have written, "Hope is the thing with feathers that builds its nest in storms, not perches in the soul." The storm version was truer to my experience. Each author's voice was distinct, matching what I knew about their regional backgrounds and historical periods. But more than that, they were providing information that wasn't available in any biography or literary criticism I'd ever read. I started recording these sessions, capturing the whispered voices that accompanied the scanning process. The audio files I'm sharing with you contain some of the clearest examples, but the phenomenon wasn't limited to famous authors. When I scanned lesser-known works, poetry chapbooks, self-published novels, regional histories, I heard voices that had never been recorded or documented. Authors whose names appear only on title pages, whose lives and personalities were completely unknown to literary history. A woman who had published a volume of nature poetry in 1847 under the initials MRS whispered to me. My name was Margaret Rose Sullivan. I was a teacher in upstate New York, and I wrote these poems while walking in the woods after school. I never married because I loved another woman, and such love wasn't acceptable then. But my poems were about that love, disguised as descriptions of flowers and seasons. Another voice, belonging to someone who had self-published a novel about Western expansion in 1878, told me, "I was actually a woman writing under a man's name. Everything in that book came from my own experience traveling west with my family in a covered wagon. The publishing house wouldn't have accepted it from a female author, so I created a male persona." I began to understand that the digitization process was somehow providing a channel for these authors to reclaim their authentic voices, to tell the stories behind their published works, to reveal the personal experiences that had shaped their writing. But the voices weren't just providing biographical information. They were actively involved in the preservation process itself. Sometimes an author's voice would interrupt the scanning to warn me about pages that needed special handling. "Be careful with page 47. There's a water stain that makes the ink fragile. The binding on this volume is loose. Support it from underneath or you'll damage the spine." This poem on page 23 was misprinted in the original. The third line should read, "Beneath the starlit sky," not "beneath the startled sky." I started following their guidance, and the quality of my digitization work improved dramatically. My supervisor began complimenting me on my attention to detail and my ability to identify preservation issues that other technicians had missed. But the most extraordinary development came 3 weeks ago, when I was scanning a collection of anonymous manuscripts, works with no identified authors, no publication information, no historical context beyond their estimated dates of creation. As I scanned these orphaned texts, voices began identifying themselves and providing the missing historical information. I wrote this during the winter of 1834. My name was Thomas Hartwell, and I was a ship's carpenter in Boston Harbor. This was my attempt to record the stories that the sailors told during the long nights when the harbor was frozen. These are my poems about slavery, written in 1852. I couldn't publish them under my real name because I was a plantation owner's daughter in Georgia. My name was Catherine Moorfield, and these verses contain my witness to horrors that I couldn't speak about publicly. I was documenting previously unknown voices from American literary history, preserving not just their words, but their authentic identities and the stories behind their creation. The audio files I've included with this account contain recordings of these voices. I know they sound impossible, but I want you to hear what I've been experiencing. Mr. Cronkite, I think our digitization project has opened a doorway between the past and present. These authors spent their lives creating works that they hoped would outlast their physical existence. The process of converting their books into digital formats may be providing them with a way to ensure their authentic voices and stories are preserved along with their written words. But I'm also starting to worry about the implications. If the digital scanning process can somehow capture or channel consciousness from the past, what happens to that consciousness when the scanning is complete? Are we trapping these voices in electronic systems? Are we creating digital prisons for souls that should be at rest? Last night, as I was finishing the final book in the American Literature collection, I heard multiple voices speaking simultaneously through the scanner's audio system. Not chaotic or frightening, but like a choir of authors offering a collective message. Thank you for preserving our words with such care. Thank you for listening to our stories. We are ready to rest now, knowing that our authentic voices will be remembered. The scanning equipment fell silent after that, returning to its normal computerized announcements. But I found a note in the scanner's output tray, printed on modern paper in fonts that matched the historical periods of the authors I'd been digitizing. The work of preserving human voices across time is sacred work. You have helped us complete what we started in life. Continue with dedication, and know that the authors whose works you preserve are grateful for your service. I think libraries and archives that are involved in digitization projects need to be aware that they may be dealing with more than just historical documents. They may be providing a bridge between past and present that allows consciousness itself to be preserved and transmitted across time. If other digital preservation specialists are experiencing similar phenomena, I want them to know they're not alone. And I want them to approach their work with the reverence it deserves, because they may be the guardians not just of historical texts, but of the souls who created them. Respectfully, Mia P.S. I've included 3 audio files with this account. Please listen to them and decide whether they should be shared with your audience. I think people need to know what's happening in our digital archives.
Mia, I've listened to your audio files, and I have to say they're some of the most compelling evidence I've ever encountered of consciousness surviving beyond physical death. The voices are clearly distinct from each other, historically accurate in their speech patterns and regional accents, and they're providing information that simply isn't available in published sources. Let me play a brief excerpt from one of these files for our listeners. This is from your recording of what you believe was Walt Whitman's voice commenting on his own poetry. I wrote these lines after visiting the wounded soldiers in Washington. People think my poems about war are abstract, philosophical. They're not. They're about specific young men whose names I knew, whose hands I held as they died. Democracy isn't an idea to me. It's the face of every person I met who believed in something larger than themselves. That voice carries an authenticity and emotional weight that would be difficult to fabricate, folks. The accent, the cadence, the intimate knowledge of historical details, it all corresponds to what we know about Whitman's experiences during the Civil War, but Mia raises an important question about the implications of this technology. If digital scanning equipment can somehow preserve or channel consciousness from the past, then our libraries and archives may be dealing with preservation challenges that go far beyond maintaining paper and ink. The sun is beginning to rise outside the studio now, painting the fog with soft golden light. But we've still got more stories to share before we close tonight's program. Coming up, we have accounts from medical libraries where the intersection of healing and knowledge has created some particularly intense supernatural encounters. And I want to remind our listeners that if you work in digitization, scanning, or any form of electronic preservation, and you've experienced voices, sounds, or phenomena that can't be explained by your equipment alone, we want to hear from you. Because tonight has revealed something extraordinary about the nature of human consciousness and its relationship to the written word. Some commitments to preserving knowledge may indeed transcend death itself, finding new expression through the very technologies we use to safeguard our cultural heritage. Stay with us through these final hours, Night Owls. The spirits of America's literary past have more to tell us, and the dawn shift workers are about to inherit institutions that are far more active and alive than most people realize. This is Edward Cronkite on WNMR, Nocturnal Mysteries Radio, broadcasting from the Blackwood Forest, where the morning mist is lifting to reveal a world transformed by the stories we've shared together. The fog has finally lifted completely, folks, and I can see the forest stretching out in all directions around our little broadcasting station. Dawn is breaking over the blackwood trees, painting everything in shades of gold and amber that remind me somehow of the aged pages we've been discussing all night. It's beautiful. But there's also something melancholy about this transition from darkness to light, as if the supernatural energy that's been building throughout our broadcast is beginning to fade with the approaching day. But we're not quite finished yet. I just received what appears to be the final communication of the night, hand-delivered by someone who knocked on our studio door just moments ago. When I opened it, I found no one there. Just an envelope lying on our doorstep, still warm to the touch, with the Johns Hopkins Medical Library seal embossed on expensive stationery. The letter inside is from someone who identifies himself as Ethan, and his account pushes our exploration into territory we haven't ventured yet tonight: the intersection of medical knowledge and supernatural experience, where the study of life and death takes on particularly intense meaning. Johns Hopkins isn't just any medical institution. It's one of the most prestigious medical schools and hospitals in the world, a place where cutting-edge research meets centuries-old traditions of healing. Their medical library houses some of the most important collections of medical texts in existence, including historical volumes that document humanity's long struggle to understand disease, anatomy, and the fragile boundary between life and death. Ethan's handwriting is precise, clearly someone accustomed to taking detailed notes under pressure. But there's an urgency in his words that suggests he needed to share this experience before his courage failed him. Let me read you what he wrote.
Mr. Cronkite, I've been listening to your program tonight through earphones while working a double shift here at Johns Hopkins. The stories your listeners have shared mirror experiences I've been having for the past 2 months, and I finally understand that I'm not losing my mind. My name is Ethan. I'm 31 years old, and I have what might be the strangest job description in academic medicine. I'm both a registered nurse in the emergency department and an after-hours librarian for our medical archives. Johns Hopkins maintains one of the world's most comprehensive collections of historical medical texts, and someone needs to be available during emergency situations when researchers or attending physicians need immediate access to rare materials. The combination of nursing and library science might seem unusual, but it makes perfect sense in a teaching hospital environment. Emergency situations often require quick access to historical case studies, unusual treatment protocols, or documentation of rare conditions. My medical training helps me understand what doctors are looking for, while my library certification ensures that irreplaceable historical materials are handled properly even during crisis situations. Most of my archive work happens during overnight shifts when the emergency department is relatively quiet and researchers have time to consult historical materials. The medical library's rare book collection is housed in a secure area adjacent to the emergency department, accessible through a series of keycard-controlled doors that maintain strict environmental control for the preservation of centuries-old medical texts. We're talking about materials that span the entire history of medical knowledge, medieval treatises on anatomy, 18th century surgical manuals, 19th century case studies of diseases that have since been eradicated. These books represent humanity's long struggle to understand the human body and develop effective treatments for injury and illness. But what makes these collections particularly intense is their subject matter. Many of these texts deal with death, disease, and human suffering in explicit detail. Medieval plague treatises describing symptoms and progression of the Black Death. Civil War surgical manuals illustrating battlefield amputations. 19th century psychiatric texts documenting treatments that we now recognize as barbaric. These books have absorbed centuries of human pain, hope, and desperate attempts to preserve life in the face of overwhelming disease and injury. 2 months ago, I was working a particularly quiet overnight shift when I received a request from Dr. Sarah Chen, one of our infectious disease specialists. She was researching a rare parasitic infection in a patient and needed access to a 19th century tropical medicine text that contained the most complete historical documentation of the condition. The book she needed was housed in our restricted archive, a climate-controlled vault, where we keep materials that are too fragile or valuable for general circulation. I made my way to the archive around 2 a.m., using my key card to access the series of secured doors that protect the collection. The restricted archive is a small, windowless room lined with custom-built shelving designed to protect books from light, humidity, and temperature fluctuations. LED lighting provides soft, warm illumination that won't damage sensitive materials. The only sounds are the soft hum of environmental control systems and the occasional distant announcement from the hospital's paging system. I located the book Dr. Chen needed, a leather-bound volume from 1887 titled Tropical Parasitology, a comprehensive guide to endemic diseases of the colonial territories by Dr. Malcolm Hartwell. The book was in remarkably good condition, its binding intact, and pages still flexible despite being over 130 years old. I was preparing to take the volume to Dr. Chen when I heard something that stopped me cold. The sound of a child singing, not coming from the hospital's public address system, but from within the archive itself. A soft, sweet voice singing what sounded like a lullaby in a language I couldn't identify. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, the kind of song a mother might sing to comfort a sick child. I looked around the small archive space, but I was clearly alone. The singing continued, seeming to come from the direction of the book I was holding. When I opened the volume to examine it more closely, the singing grew louder and more distinct. The book had fallen open to a section on pediatric parasitology, specifically a chapter dealing with tropical diseases affecting children in British colonial territories. The page contained detailed medical illustrations of parasitic organisms, drawings that were scientifically accurate but somehow seemed to be watching me. Their cellular structures arranged in patterns that suggested faces, eyes, expressions of profound sadness. As I stared at these illustrations, the lullaby continued, and I began to understand that I was hearing the voices of children who had died from the diseases documented in this book. Young patients from colonial hospitals, victims of parasitic infections that 19th century medicine couldn't effectively treat. The singing was accompanied by something else, the scent of disinfectant mixed with something sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in a sick room. And underneath these odors, the faint smell of old ink and preservation chemicals from the book itself. I tried to close the volume, but the pages seemed to resist, flipping open repeatedly to the same section on pediatric parasitology. Each time the book opened, I heard more voices, not just singing now, but whispered words in various languages. Mama, me duele. Mama, it hurts. Mummy, I can't see properly. Papa, quand est-ce que je vais mieux? Papa, when will I get better? These were the voices of children who had suffered from the diseases Dr. Hartwell had documented, preserved somehow in the pages where their conditions had been clinically described and illustrated. I realized I was experiencing something that went beyond simple supernatural phenomena. These children had been reduced to medical case studies, their individual personalities and experiences subsumed into scientific documentation. But their essential humanity, their fear, their pain, their longing for comfort, had somehow become embedded in the very book that recorded their suffering. The lullaby grew more complex, with multiple voices joining in harmony. I understood intuitively that these were songs the children had remembered from healthier times, melodies their mothers had sung to them before illness struck. They were trying to comfort each other, creating a choir of young voices united by shared experience of pain and premature death. But there was something else mixed in with their singing. Adult voices, older and more serious, speaking in the measured tones of medical professionals. Patient exhibits advanced symptoms of Plasmodium falciparum infection. Chronic intestinal parasitosis resulting in severe malnutrition. Subject expired at 03:47 hours despite all available interventions. I was hearing not just the voices of the children who had died, but also the doctors who had treated them, the nurses who had cared for them, the researchers who had documented their cases. All of them bound together in this book, continuing to struggle with diseases and conditions that 19th century medicine couldn't effectively address. Dr. Hartwell's own voice emerged from the chorus, tired and deeply sad. I spent 40 years documenting these conditions, hoping that future generations would develop better treatments. Every child I couldn't save haunts me still. I thought detailed documentation might somehow redeem their suffering, might help other doctors save children with similar conditions. I understood then that I was witnessing the spiritual residue of medical practice in an era when physicians could observe and document illness with scientific precision, but had limited ability to actually cure their patients. The book contained not just clinical information, but the accumulated grief and frustration of medical professionals who had watched too many children die from preventable diseases. The voices began to fade, but before they disappeared completely, I heard a final message from Dr. Hartwell. Take this knowledge to your colleagues. Help them understand that every patient is a complete human being, not just a collection of symptoms. The children whose cases I documented deserve to be remembered as individuals, not just as medical examples. When the archive fell silent, I found that the book had closed itself and returned to normal. But tucked between its pages was a handwritten note on modern hospital stationery. Dr. Chen, the information you need is on page 247, but please remember that the cases described there were real children with families who loved them. Their medical conditions don't tell their complete stories. E.H. I delivered the book to Dr. Chen along with the note, explaining that I had found some additional historical context that might be relevant to her research. She was puzzled by the note, but thanked me for the extra information. The next morning, I learned that Dr. Chen had successfully identified her patient's condition using the historical reference and had developed an effective treatment protocol. But she also mentioned that reading the 19th century case studies had reminded her to consider the human element of her patient's experience, not just the clinical symptoms. Since that night, I've encountered similar phenomena whenever I access historical medical texts during overnight shifts. The books in our collection aren't just repositories of clinical information. They're memorials to countless patients and medical professionals whose experiences shaped the development of modern medicine. Sometimes I hear the voices of Civil War surgeons struggling to save wounded soldiers with primitive tools and limited knowledge. Other times I encounter the spirits of nurses who worked during epidemic outbreaks, caring for patients even when they knew they might contract deadly diseases themselves. But most frequently, I hear the voices of patients, people of all ages who suffered from conditions that historical medicine couldn't effectively treat. They're not angry or vengeful. They're simply trying to ensure that their experiences aren't forgotten, that their suffering contributed somehow to the advancement of medical knowledge. Last week, while accessing a 1918 text on influenza treatment, I heard the voice of a young doctor who had died during the pandemic. I kept detailed notes hoping they would help other physicians. I never saw the development of effective treatments, but I hope my observations saved lives in future outbreaks. These encounters have changed how I approach my work in both the emergency department and the medical archives. I've become more aware that every patient represents a link in an unbroken chain of human suffering and healing that stretches back centuries. The medical knowledge we use to save lives today was built on the documented experiences of countless patients who couldn't be saved by the medicine of their time. Mr. Cronkite, I think medical libraries and archives are particularly active supernatural environments because they deal with the most fundamental human experiences: life, death, suffering, and the desperate attempt to preserve life in the face of disease and injury. The spirits that inhabit these collections aren't malevolent. They're the accumulated presence of everyone who has struggled with illness, everyone who has tried to heal the sick, everyone who has dedicated their life to advancing medical knowledge. They remain connected to these books and documents because their experiences are preserved there, and they want to ensure that future generations learn not just from their clinical observations, but from their humanity. If other medical librarians or healthcare workers have encountered similar phenomena, I want them to know that these experiences are meaningful. The voices we hear represent the spiritual foundation of medical practice, the recognition that healing is fundamentally about preserving human life and dignity, not just treating biological systems. Thank you for providing a forum where these experiences can be shared. The intersection of healing and supernatural experience deserves serious consideration, especially in institutions where life and death decisions are made every day. Respectfully, Ethan P.S. As I finish writing this letter, I can hear the faint sound of lullabies coming through the hospital's paging system, though no music is officially being broadcast. I think the children are singing to current patients, offering comfort to young people who are facing serious medical challenges. Even in death, they continue to provide care and healing.
Ethan, your account touches on something profound about the nature of medical practice and the preservation of human experience through clinical documentation. What you've described suggests that medical libraries and archives may serve as repositories, not just for scientific knowledge, but for the accumulated compassion and dedication of everyone who has participated in the healing arts. The fact that these voices express concern for current patients, that they want their documented suffering to contribute to better care for future generations, speaks to something beautiful about the continuity of medical dedication across time. These spirits seem to understand that their historical experiences remain relevant to contemporary healing. I did some research on Dr. Malcolm Hartwell after reading your letter, and I found records indicating that he spent most of his career in colonial medical service, documenting tropical diseases that were claiming thousands of young lives throughout the British Empire. His work was instrumental in developing early prevention protocols for several parasitic conditions, but it came at tremendous personal cost. He lost 2 of his own children to the diseases he was studying. If his spirit is indeed still connected to his research through that book, then his continued concern for pediatric patients makes perfect sense. He spent his life trying to save children from preventable diseases, and death apparently didn't end that commitment. The sun is fully up now, folks, and I can hear the morning sounds of the forest beginning to stir around our little broadcasting station. Birds calling to each other, small animals moving through the underbrush, the normal sounds of a world waking up to another day. But after the experiences we've shared tonight, even these ordinary sounds seem charged with significance. We've got 2 more accounts to share before we close this extraordinary night of broadcasting, stories that will take us to the very heart of why libraries and archives seem to attract such intense supernatural activity, and what it means for those of us who work in these institutions. The guardians of human knowledge, it seems, take their responsibilities very seriously indeed. Some commitments to preserving and sharing information transcend even death itself. Stay with us for these final stories, dear listeners. The night shift is almost over, but the voices from our cultural institutions have a few more secrets to share. This is Edward Cronkite on WNMR, Nocturnal Mysteries Radio, broadcasting from the Blackwood Forest, where the morning light is revealing a world transformed by the conversations we've shared together. The coffee in my mug has gone cold again, folks, but I find I don't need caffeine anymore to stay alert. Something about this night, about the stories we've shared, and the energy that's been building in this little studio has left me more awake and aware than I've felt in years. Outside, the full light of dawn is streaming through the forest, but inside our broadcasting booth, It still feels like we're suspended in that magical space between midnight and morning where impossible things become possible. We're approaching the end of our journey through the supernatural side of America's cultural institutions. But I've got one more account that arrived just moments ago via what appears to be medical courier service. The envelope bears the seal of the New York Academy of Medicine, and inside is a letter written on official letterhead in handwriting so elegant it could have come from a much earlier era. The New York Academy of Medicine isn't just any medical library. It's one of the oldest and most prestigious medical institutions in America, founded in 1847 and housed in a magnificent Gothic Revival building that looks more like a cathedral than a modern research facility. Their library contains over 550,000 volumes, including some of the rarest medical texts in existence, ranging from medieval manuscripts on herbal healing to cutting-edge contemporary research. But what makes the Academy particularly special is their approach to medical scholarship. This isn't just a library, it's a community of researchers, physicians, historians, and scholars who view medicine as both a science and a humanistic discipline. Their reading rooms are designed to encourage contemplation and deep study, with an atmosphere that promotes the kind of careful, thoughtful research that produces breakthrough insights. The letter is from someone named Chloe, who manages what they call the scholars' private study rooms, exclusive spaces where researchers can spend extended periods working with rare materials that require special handling and security measures. Her handwriting is remarkable, the kind of careful penmanship that suggests someone who spends their days working with historical documents and has developed an appreciation for the lost art of beautiful writing. Let me share what Chloe experienced.
Dear Mr. Cronkite, I'm writing this letter by hand because the experience I need to share seems to call for something more personal than digital communication. My name is Chloe. I'm 28 years old, and I serve as the private study room coordinator at the New York Academy of Medicine's library. My position involves managing a series of small, private reading rooms where scholars can work with our most valuable and restricted materials. These rooms are designed for researchers who need extended, uninterrupted access to rare medical texts. Historians writing books about the development of surgical techniques, physicians researching historical approaches to rare diseases, scholars translating ancient medical manuscripts into modern languages. Each private study room is furnished with period-appropriate furniture, heavy wooden desks, comfortable leather chairs, brass reading lamps that provide warm, steady light without producing harmful UV radiation. The atmosphere is deliberately designed to encourage deep contemplative study, the kind of research that requires hours of careful attention to detailed texts. The Academy's rare book collection includes medical texts dating back to the 13th century, medieval manuscripts on herbal remedies, Renaissance anatomical studies, 18th century surgical manuals that documented procedures we can barely imagine today. These books represent over 7 centuries of human attempts to understand disease, injury, and the mysterious processes that maintain life. Working with these materials requires not just academic expertise, but a deep respect for the knowledge and dedication they represent. Every page was hand-copied by scribes who believed they were preserving life-saving information. Every illustration was drawn by artists who were documenting cutting-edge medical understanding. Every binding was crafted to protect knowledge that might mean the difference between life and death for future patients. 6 weeks ago, I was preparing Study Room 7 for a visiting researcher from Oxford who was examining our collection of 17th century obstetric texts. Dr. Margaret Ashford was writing a book about the development of midwifery practices and needed access to manuscripts that documented childbirth procedures from before the era of modern medical intervention. Study Room 7 is one of our most beautiful spaces, a corner room with tall Gothic windows that provide natural light during the day, supplemented by carefully positioned reading lamps for evening work. The room contains a massive oak desk that dates to the Academy's founding in 1847, along with custom-built shelving for temporary storage of materials being actively researched. I was arranging Dr. Ashford's requested materials when I first noticed something unusual. The room felt occupied, despite being empty. Not uncomfortably so, but with the sense that someone else was present who shared an interest in the medical texts I was handling. The materials Dr. Ashford had requested included several manuscripts that dealt with maternal and infant mortality in the 17th century. Texts that documented the dangerous reality of childbirth in an era before antiseptic procedures, effective pain management, or surgical intervention for complications. Reading these manuscripts is emotionally challenging because they describe in clinical detail the deaths of countless women and children who might have survived with modern medical care. As I arranged these texts on the reading table, I became aware of a subtle scent in the room, something floral and sweet, like morning glories or honeysuckle. Not the usual smell of old paper and leather bindings, but something fresh and natural, as if someone had brought flowers into the room. I looked around but saw no floral arrangements, no obvious source for the scent. The windows were closed, and our building's ventilation system doesn't introduce outside air directly into the study rooms. When I returned to my work, arranging the manuscripts in chronological order for Dr. Ashford's research, I heard a sound that made me pause. The soft click-clack of wooden shoes on the hardwood floor. The sound was rhythmic and deliberate, like someone walking slowly around the room, examining the materials I was preparing. But when I looked up, the room was empty. The footsteps continued, moving from the windows to the bookshelves to the reading table, as if someone was conducting their own inspection of the space. That's when I saw her. At first, it was just a glimpse in my peripheral vision, a figure in white moving near the tall Gothic windows. When I turned to look directly, I could see her more clearly, a woman in her 30s or 40s, wearing what appeared to be 17th century dress, a long white gown with fitted bodice and flowing sleeves, a white cap that partially concealed dark hair arranged in the style of the period. She was beautiful in a way that seemed both timeless and specific to her historical era. High cheekbones, intelligent dark eyes, hands that moved with the careful precision of someone accustomed to detailed work. But what struck me most was her expression, a mixture of deep sadness and profound dedication, as if she was carrying the weight of important responsibilities. She moved with purpose through the room, examining the manuscripts I had arranged on the reading table. When she paused at a particular text, a 1654 treatise on difficult births, she looked directly at me and spoke in a voice that was soft but clearly audible. These books hold so much pain, so many losses, but they also preserve knowledge that helped save other mothers, other children. The women who died were not forgotten if their suffering taught physicians how to save lives. Her accent was educated, precise, with the formal pronunciation you might expect from someone of her apparent social class and historical period. But underneath the formal speech, I could hear deep emotional investment in what she was saying. She gestured toward the manuscripts and continued, "I was a midwife in London during the Great Plague years. I delivered over 300 children, and I lost too many mothers, too many babies to diseases and complications that we didn't understand. I kept detailed records, hoping that physicians in future times would learn from our experiences. I realized I was speaking with someone who had lived through the medical challenges documented in the very books Dr. Ashford would be studying. A practitioner whose experiences had contributed to the historical record, whose knowledge had been preserved in the academic texts we were treating as scholarly sources. The woman, I began thinking of her as the midwife, moved to a specific manuscript, a leather-bound journal that was listed in our catalog simply as Anonymous Obstetric Records, London, 1665 to 1671. "These are my notes," she said, touching the manuscript gently. "My records of births during the plague years. I documented everything: successful deliveries, complications, treatments that worked, procedures that failed. I hope that future midwives and physicians would benefit from what I learned." She opened the manuscript to reveal pages of detailed handwriting, case studies of difficult births, notes on herbal remedies and surgical techniques. But what made this extraordinary was that I was looking at these historical records while speaking to the person who had created them. "Dr. Ashford's research is important," the midwife continued. "She understands that these old books aren't just academic curiosities. They document real experiences of real women, real attempts to preserve life under impossible circumstances." Over the next hour, as I completed my preparations for Dr. Ashford's research, the midwife provided commentary on various manuscripts in the collection. She identified which treatments had been effective, which procedures had been dangerous, which authors had been working from personal experience versus academic theory. But more than just clinical information, she shared the human context behind the medical documentation. This author lost his own wife in childbirth, which is why his writing about cesarean procedures is so passionate. This manuscript was written by a woman who disguised herself as a male physician because female practitioners weren't allowed to publish medical texts. This journal documents births in a workhouse where the poorest women received care. The author was trying to prove that proper medical attention could save lives regardless of social class. As our conversation continued, I understood that I was receiving a master class in medical history from someone who had lived through the period Dr. Ashford was studying. The midwife wasn't just a supernatural presence, she was a historical consultant, providing insights that weren't available in any published source. When Dr. Ashford arrived the next morning to begin her research, I introduced her to the materials with additional context that I had learned from my overnight encounter. I didn't mention the supernatural aspect, but I was able to provide historical background and research directions that proved invaluable to her work. Dr. Ashford spent 2 weeks in study room 7, and during that time, I continued to encounter the midwife during evening hours. Sometimes I would find her reading over Dr. Ashford's research notes, nodding approvingly at insights and interpretations that aligned with her lived experience. Other times, she would direct my attention to manuscripts that weren't part of Dr. Ashford's original research plan, but contained information relevant to her project. Texts that had been misfiled or overlooked, documents that provided crucial context for understanding 17th century obstetric practices. On Dr. Ashford's final day, I found a handwritten note tucked into one of the manuscripts. "Dr. Ashford, your research honors the experiences of women who suffered and died to advance medical knowledge. You understand that we were not just historical subjects, but real people who hoped our experiences would help future generations. Thank you for telling our stories with respect and accuracy." A grateful colleague. When Dr. Ashford found the note, she was deeply moved. She told me it reminded her why she had chosen to study medical history, not just to document the development of medical techniques, but to preserve the human experiences that shaped the advancement of healing arts. Since Dr. Ashford's departure, I've continued to encounter the midwife during my evening work in the study rooms. She appears whenever researchers are working with obstetric or pediatric materials, always eager to ensure that contemporary scholars understand the human context behind historical medical documentation. But I've also realized that she's not the only spirit connected to our collection. Last week, while preparing materials for a researcher studying 19th century surgical techniques, I encountered a gentleman in formal Victorian dress who identified himself as a surgeon who had worked without anesthesia during the Civil War. He provided commentary on amputation procedures that helped our visiting researcher understand techniques that seemed brutal by modern standards, but were revolutionary for their time. Mr. Cronkite, I think medical libraries like the Academy of Medicine serve as gathering places for the spirits of everyone who dedicated their lives to healing and medical knowledge. These institutions preserve not just clinical information, but the accumulated wisdom and compassion of practitioners who treated patients under conditions we can barely imagine. The spirits I've encountered aren't trapped or restless. They're actively engaged in ongoing medical education, ensuring that contemporary practitioners understand the human experiences that shape the development of modern medicine. They want their suffering, their dedication, their knowledge to continue contributing to the advancement of healing arts. Working with these spirits has deepened my appreciation for the materials in our collection. Every medical text represents real people who lived, suffered, learned, and hoped their experiences would benefit future patients. The Academy's library isn't just a repository of historical information. It's a community that includes practitioners from across the centuries, all united by their commitment to preserving and advancing medical knowledge. Belle. If other medical librarians have encountered similar spirits, I hope they'll approach these experiences with the respect they deserve. These are our professional ancestors, and they have much to teach us about the true meaning of medical dedication. Thank you for providing a forum where these experiences can be shared. The intersection of medical practice and supernatural encounter deserves serious consideration, especially in institutions dedicated to preserving the history of healing. Respectfully, Chloe. P.S. As I finish this letter, I can smell morning glories again, and I hear the soft sound of wooden shoes on the floor behind me. The midwife is reading over my shoulder, and she's nodding approvingly. I think she's pleased that her story will be shared with people who might understand the continuing importance of her work.
Chloe, thank you for sharing the midwife's story, and please convey my deep respect for her continued dedication to medical education and the preservation of women's experiences in medical history. What you've described represents something beautiful about the continuity of healing arts across time, the recognition that medical knowledge is built on the documented experiences of countless practitioners who worked under conditions far more challenging than anything we face today. The fact that these spirits are actively engaged in contemporary medical education, that they're providing historical context and guidance to current researchers, suggests something profound about the nature of medical dedication. Some commitments to healing and preserving life apparently transcend even death itself. I researched the Academy of Medicine's archives after reading your letter, and I found references to several anonymous medical manuscripts from the 17th century that contain extraordinarily detailed obstetric records. These documents have been praised by medical historians for their clinical accuracy and compassionate approach to documenting maternal experiences, but their authors remain unknown to academic scholarship. If your midwife is indeed connected to these historical documents, then she's been contributing to medical knowledge for over 3 centuries, first through her original practice and documentation, and now through her continued guidance of contemporary researchers. The morning light is streaming into our studio now with full summer intensity, and I can hear the normal sounds of a world waking up to another day. But after the night we've shared, even these ordinary sounds seem charged with significance. We've discovered that our cultural institutions, our libraries, archives, and repositories of human knowledge are far more active and alive than most people realize. We have one final story to share before we close this extraordinary night of broadcasting, a tale that will bring us full circle to where we started, with the understanding that dedication to preserving human knowledge and culture creates bonds that transcend the boundary between life and death. Stay with us for this last account, dear listeners. The night shift is ending, but the guardians of human knowledge never really clock out. This is Edward Cronkite on WNMR, Nocturnal Mysteries Radio, broadcasting from the Blackwood Forest, where the morning sun is burning away the last traces of supernatural mist and revealing a world transformed by the stories we've shared together. Well, folks, we've come to the end of our journey through the supernatural side of America's great libraries and archives. The sun is now fully risen over the Blackwood Forest, and I can see the morning commuters starting their drives on the distant highway, completely unaware that they're traveling through a landscape that's been transformed by the stories we've shared over the past 8 hours. But we have one final account to share before we sign off for the morning, and it's perhaps the most fitting conclusion to our night of exploration that I could have imagined. This last story takes us to the very heart of American academic tradition, Harvard University's Widener Library, the largest academic library in the world and a temple to human learning that has been serving scholars for over a century. The letter arrived just moments ago through what I can only describe as supernatural delivery service. I heard footsteps on our front porch. Opened the door to find no one there, but discovered an envelope bearing the Harvard University seal lying on the doormat, still warm as if it had just been hand-delivered from across the country. Inside is an account from someone named Liam, who works as a rare books curator in the deepest levels of the Widener library system. For those who've never experienced Widener, we're talking about a building that contains over 3.5 million books, with 10 levels of underground stacks that extend deep beneath Harvard Yard. It's a labyrinth of knowledge that would take a lifetime to fully explore, and according to Liam's account, some of its former inhabitants are still exploring it. Let me read you what Liam experienced, and then I'll share some final thoughts about what we've learned during our night together.
Mr. Cronkite, I've been listening to your broadcast all night through headphones while conducting inventory work in the sub-basement levels of Widener Library. The stories your listeners have shared resonate deeply with experiences I've been having for the past year, and I finally understand that I'm part of a community of people who've encountered the supernatural side of institutional scholarship. My name is Liam. I'm 33 years old, and I work as senior curator of manuscript collections in the Widener Library's restricted access areas. My office is located 7 levels below ground in sections of the building that most Harvard students and faculty never see. These are the deep stacks, where we house materials that are too valuable, too fragile, or too specialized for general circulation. Working in the sub-basements of Widener is like being a custodian of human memory itself. The collections I manage include medieval manuscripts, colonial American documents, personal papers of Nobel Prize winners, and correspondence from historical figures whose names appear in every American history textbook. These materials represent over 1,000 years of human intellectual achievement, preserved in climate-controlled conditions that will allow them to survive for centuries to come. But what makes working in these deep levels particularly intense is the sense of accumulated human presence. Every document in our collection represents someone's thoughts, dreams, discoveries, or desperate attempts to preserve important information for future generations. Walking through these underground corridors feels like moving through the collective memory of human civilization. The incident I need to share occurred 3 weeks ago during one of my regular midnight inventory sessions. Harvard's rare book collections are so extensive that maintaining accurate records requires ongoing attention, and I often work overnight shifts when the building is quiet, and I can focus on detailed cataloging without interruption. I was conducting inventory in stack level B7, one of our deepest storage areas, where we house 19th century American literature manuscripts. The area is accessible only through a series of keycard-controlled doors, and during overnight hours, I'm typically the only person in that section of the building. Stack level B7 has the atmosphere of a medieval monastery library. Narrow corridors lined with floor-to-ceiling shelving, soft LED lighting that provides just enough illumination for detailed work, and the constant whisper of climate control systems maintaining perfect preservation conditions. The silence is so complete that you can hear your own heartbeat, and every small sound seems amplified in the enclosed space. I was working my way through a section containing correspondence from 19th century New England authors when I heard something that made me pause, a soft crackling sound, like old paper being carefully handled, coming from somewhere deeper in the stacks. This wasn't particularly unusual. Old buildings make noises. Climate control systems cause materials to expand and contract, and papers sometimes settle in their storage containers. But as I listened more carefully, the sound seemed too rhythmic, too purposeful to be random building noise. I followed the sound deeper into the stacks, using my headlamp to illuminate the narrow corridors between the tall shelving units. The crackling continued, accompanied by what sounded like books being moved and repositioned, as if someone was conducting their own inventory work in an adjacent section. That's when I heard the first voice, soft, elderly, with the cultured accent of an educated New Englander from an earlier era. "Now, where did I put that Thoreau correspondence? It should be right here with the other Concord materials," I called out, thinking perhaps one of our senior faculty members had gained after-hours access for emergency research. "Hello? Dr. Morrison? Is that you?" The voice stopped immediately, but the sound of papers being handled continued. I moved closer to the source, to whom, navigating between tall stacks of manuscript boxes, following the sound through a series of narrow corridors I rarely had occasion to visit. As I turned a corner into a section housing Civil War-era documents, I saw something that stopped me cold. A man in late 19th century dress standing at one of the research tables, examining what appeared to be a leather-bound journal by the light of an old-fashioned oil lamp. He was probably in his 70s, with white hair and a carefully maintained beard, wearing a three-piece wool suit and a tweed hat that looked like standard academic attire from the 1890s. But what was most remarkable was that I could see through him, not completely transparent, but with the translucent quality of someone who existed in our space, but not quite in our time. When he noticed me watching, he looked up from his work and smiled kindly, touching the brim of his hat in polite greeting. "Good evening, young man. I hope I'm not disturbing your work. I was just checking on some materials that came in during my tenure. Wanted to make sure they're being properly cared for." His voice was warm and scholarly, with the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to academic discussion. Despite the supernatural nature of our encounter, I felt immediately comfortable in his presence, as if I were speaking with a distinguished colleague rather than a ghost. "I'm sorry," I replied. not sure of the proper protocol for addressing spirits. I don't think we've been introduced. I'm Liam, the current manuscript curator. Delighted to meet you, Liam. I'm Professor Archibald Coolidge, and I had the honor of serving as the first director of this library when it opened in 1915. I understand you're doing important work preserving these collections. I knew the name, of course. Archibald Cary Coolidge had been one of Harvard's most distinguished librarians, instrumental in developing the research collections that made Widener one of the world's great academic libraries. He had died in 1928, but apparently his dedication to the institution had continued long past his physical death. I've been watching your work, young man, Professor Coolidge continued, and I'm impressed by your attention to detail. But I wanted to share something with you that might help with your inventory project. He gestured to the stacks around us, and I realized that the materials appeared to be organized differently than I remembered. Books and manuscript boxes had been repositioned, creating a more logical arrangement that would make research access significantly more efficient. I've been spending my evenings reorganizing some of the collections according to research patterns I observed during my lifetime, he explained. Sometimes institutional knowledge gets lost over the decades, and materials end up stored in ways that make them difficult for scholars to locate. Over the next hour, Professor Coolidge led me through several sections of the stacks, pointing out organizational improvements he had made and explaining the historical context behind various collections. His knowledge was encyclopedic. He could discuss the provenance of individual manuscripts, the research value of specific document collections, and the relationships between different authors and historical figures whose papers we housed. But more than just providing information, he was sharing his philosophy of librarianship. A library isn't just a storage facility for books and papers, he told me. It's a living institution where the accumulated knowledge of human civilization remains active and accessible. Our job isn't just to preserve these materials. It's to ensure they continue to contribute to human learning and understanding. As we talked, I became aware that we weren't alone in the stacks. I could hear other voices, soft conversations coming from different sections of the sub-basement, as if a community of former librarians and scholars were conducting their own evening work. Professor Coolidge noticed my awareness of these other presences and smiled. "Oh yes, we're quite an active community down here. Dr. William Harris, who ran the library before my time, still comes in most evenings to check on the medieval manuscripts. Professor Jane Stevens from the 1940s continues her work cataloging women's history materials that were overlooked during her lifetime, and young Mr. Richardson from the 1960s has been helping with the civil rights document collection." I realized I was being introduced to a hidden community of library professionals who had dedicated their lives to Widener and continued their work even after death. They weren't haunting the building in any threatening sense. They were simply continuing their professional responsibilities, ensuring that the collections they had developed remained properly maintained and accessible. "We've been waiting for someone like you," Professor Coolidge said. "Someone who understands that library work is more than just a job. It's a calling to preserve and share human knowledge. We have so much institutional memory to pass on, so many improvements to suggest, so many lost treasures to help you rediscover." As our conversation continued, Professor Coolidge led me to a section I had never explored before, deep in the oldest part of the sub-basement system. Here, he showed me a collection of materials that didn't appear in any of our official catalogs, manuscripts and documents that had apparently been misplaced or forgotten over the decades. "These represent some of our most valuable holdings," he explained. "Personal papers from Revolutionary War figures, correspondence between major American authors, scientific notebooks that document important discoveries, They were properly accessioned when they arrived, but bureaucratic changes over the years caused them to become separated from the main collections. I spent the rest of the night documenting these hidden materials, following Professor Coolidge's guidance to understand their historical significance and research value. When I checked our digital catalog the next morning, I discovered that these documents had indeed been listed as missing or possibly stolen in reports dating back decades. But the most extraordinary part of the evening came as I was preparing to leave. Professor Coolidge removed his tweed hat and handed it to me, though when I reached out to take it, my hands passed through empty air. The hat fell to the floor with a soft thud, solid and real despite having been worn by a spirit. When I picked it up, I could feel the weight and texture of genuine wool tweed still retaining the faint scent of pipe tobacco and old books. "Consider it a token of welcome to our community," Professor Coolidge said. "That hat has been in this library for over a century, and it should stay here with someone who appreciates its history." As I held the hat, I felt a gentle pressure on my shoulder, as if Professor Coolidge was placing a friendly hand there in a gesture of collegial support. "There's so much more here than you know," he said, his voice beginning to fade as dawn approached. "So many stories to discover, so much knowledge waiting to be shared. We'll help you find it all in time." When I looked up, he was gone, but the hat remained solid in my hands. I've kept it in my office ever since, and sometimes when I'm working on particularly challenging research problems, I put it on and find that solutions come more easily, as if Professor Coolidge's accumulated knowledge is somehow accessible through that simple connection. Since that night, I've encountered other members of Widener's supernatural staff during my evening work. They appear when specific collections need attention, when lost materials need to be rediscovered, when visiting researchers require access to documents that aren't readily findable through normal catalog searches. They're not ghosts in any traditional sense. They're dedicated professionals who chose to remain connected to the institution they loved, continuing their work in whatever way they can. They've made me understand that working in a place like Widener isn't just about managing historical documents. It's about participating in an unbroken chain of scholarship that connects past and future through the preservation of human knowledge. Mr. Cronkite, your listeners tonight have shared experiences that mirror my own, and I want them to know that the supernatural activity in our cultural institutions isn't something to fear. It's evidence of the profound dedication that librarians, archivists, and scholars have always brought to their work. Some commitments to preserving and sharing knowledge are apparently strong enough to transcend death itself. Those of us who work in these institutions today aren't just employees. We're the latest members of communities that span centuries, all united by our dedication to ensuring that human learning and culture survive and thrive. Thank you for providing a forum where these experiences can be shared. The spirits who inhabit our libraries and archives deserve recognition for their continued service, and those of us who encounter them deserve support and understanding. Respectfully, Liam. P.S. As I finish writing this letter, I can hear Professor Coolidge's voice from somewhere in the stacks. Make sure he knows about the Saturday broadcasts, Liam. There are stories from other institutions that need to be told. I think you can expect more communications from the supernatural side of academic America.
And there we have it, folks. 12 hours of broadcasting, 12 stories from the guardians of human knowledge, 12 glimpses into the supernatural side of America's great cultural institutions. As I sit here in our little studio watching the morning sun climb higher over the Blackwood forest, I'm struck by the common threads that run through all the accounts we've shared tonight. Every story we've heard has been about dedication, the commitment of librarians, archivists, curators, and scholars who loved their work so much that death couldn't end their service. These aren't tales of vengeful spirits or restless ghosts. They're accounts of professional colleagues who chose to remain connected to the institutions they served in life, continuing their work in whatever form they could manage. Grace at the Newberry Library, still tending to rare books that remember everyone who ever loved them. Victor at the Boston Athenaeum, helping preserve documents alongside Dorothea Harrison, who died at her workstation but never really left. Sophie at the Library of Congress, assisting Princess Ngoc Lan in ensuring that forgotten voices from history are finally heard. Liam from the Huntington, reading aloud to medieval scribes who hunger for their words to be spoken with reverence. Emily at the Folger, revealing the hidden truths of Elizabethan women who disguise their authentic voices behind masculine pseudonyms. Noah at the Binaca, working alongside Brother Francis to continue the eternal project of preserving human knowledge. Ava at the Boston Public Library, collaborating with Harold Whitman as he continues his evening rounds, ensuring that every book receives the care it deserves. Jack at the Morgan Library, witnessing the gratitude of medieval scribes whose dedication to preserving knowledge transcended their earthly existence. Mia at the New York Public Library, discovering that digital preservation technology can somehow capture and transmit the authentic voices of America's literary past. Ethan at Johns Hopkins, learning that medical libraries preserve not just clinical knowledge, but the accumulated compassion of everyone who has ever struggled to heal the sick. Chloe at the New York Academy of Medicine, receiving guidance from a 17th-century midwife whose commitment to saving lives continues 3 centuries after her death. And finally, Liam at Harvard's Widener Library, welcomed into a community of scholarly spirits who represent the living memory of American academic tradition. What strikes me most about these encounters is their positive nature. These spirits aren't threatening or malevolent. They're helpful, grateful, and deeply committed to ensuring that the institutions they served continue to fulfill their missions. They represent the best aspects of academic and cultural dedication. The understanding that preserving human knowledge and culture is work that's too important to be interrupted by something as minor as death. But I think there's an even deeper message in tonight's stories. These encounters suggest that our libraries, archives, and cultural institutions aren't just repositories of historical information. They're living communities that include everyone who has ever dedicated their life to preserving human knowledge. The boundary between past and present, between the living and the dead, becomes permeable in places where the commitment to learning and culture is strong enough to transcend normal limitations. For those of you who work in libraries, archives, museums, or any institution dedicated to preserving human culture, tonight's stories should provide both comfort and inspiration. You're not just employees doing jobs. You're members of communities that span centuries, part of an unbroken chain of dedication that connects the ancient scribes who copied manuscripts by candlelight to the digital preservation specialists using cutting-edge technology to safeguard our cultural heritage. And if you encounter the supernatural during your work, don't be afraid. You're simply meeting your professional ancestors, colleagues who share your commitment to the sacred work of preserving human knowledge and culture. Listen to them, learn from them, and know that you're part of something much larger and more important than any individual career or institutional position. The morning commute is beginning in earnest now, and I can see cars streaming along the distant highway, carrying people to offices and schools and all the ordinary business of another day. But after tonight, I'll never again think of our cultural institutions as merely buildings full of books and documents. They're active, living communities where the past and present collaborate in the eternal work of preserving human civilization. Next Saturday night, we'll be back with more stories from the supernatural side of American culture. Professor Coolidge was right. There are accounts from other institutions that need to be told, experiences from museums, historical societies, and specialized archives that will expand our understanding of how dedication to preserving human culture creates bonds that transcend even death itself. Until then, keep reading, keep learning, and remember that every book you open, every document you preserve, every story you share contributes to the great human project of maintaining our collective memory across time. This has been Edward Cronkite, broadcasting from WNNMR, Nocturnal Mysteries Radio, live from the Blackwood Forest. Thank you for joining us on this extraordinary journey through the hidden side of America's cultural institutions. And remember, the guardians of human knowledge never really retire. They just change their shift schedules. Good morning, dear listeners, sweet dreams, and we'll see you again when the darkness returns and the spirits of learning are ready to share more of their secrets.